Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. We are in week two of the Iran war, and of course, we're going to be covering everything as the global reset continues. And it looks like this week, Russia is quietly winning. So, we're going to be covering that and breaking it down into two parts today. Firstly, I'm on the move a little bit, so I've got my temporary setup. We're not in the studio this week, but the show must go on. And so in part one, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about what happened in week two of the Iran war. We covered everything in last week, and what to look out for. We'll be reviewing what we predicted, what's happening, and what the markets are telling us is going to be happening next. And this is all as a result of the Strait of Hormuz oil shock. And what a shock it is. We're going to make sure you understand it and how to interpret it. Then in part two, as usual, I'm going to make sure that you've got one of the interviews that I did this week, and that is on really the financial war behind the Iran conflict and how it relates to my theory around the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex managing this transition, what the end result will be. And that was done on BT Sessions, where they interviewed me this week, and we'll make sure that you get the interview live so that you can combine it with everything that's happened this week as well. So without further ado, let's jump straight into part one. Iran war, week two, the Hormuz shock, and really, it was a shock. Now, part one, really, we were asking in week one, the market didn't quite internalize, and I think it underreacted because it wasn't quite sure whether this was going to be some kind of Venezuela operation, or whether this was going to be long term, or whether this was going to be a managed conflict. And so week one was really just about, the shock phase of, right, this is happening. It was leading up for a long time. We've been covering it for ever since Trump was the Trump election and the Biden election. If you remember, during the Biden-Trump election way back, seems like such a long time ago, I was saying, I'm sure Trump is going to be made the president because he was the chosen one in order to deliver the Iran war. And then over time, we covered the 12-day war, where I didn't predict that that would actually happen because it looked like we were moving to that transition. But we entered into what I called a theatrical war. And if you go to my blog on simondixon.com, you can see all of these things. I record it every single week and make sure that you can go back to those if you choose. But I covered the 12-day war play by play and understood this to be a three-way theatrical victory that had very specific goals that I believed was a negotiated outcome between the factions of power. Then we move over to what is now the phase two. And so I've been saying that there would be another 12-day war. Now, when we covered it last week, I admittedly said this was way more and moving way faster than I originally predicted, which means that the managed transition to a multipolar world, I believe, is actually being managed and happening in real time. And this will be the final phase. After this, there will only be the negotiated outcome, and maybe there's additional derailing of the plan based upon additional factions of power. But I believe that everything that needs to be resolved is being resolved in this phase. Now, in week two, we got to see the most important thing beyond the bombs, beyond the missiles, beyond the enforcement of the closure. That was the shock and awe that happened in week one. Week two was really about the markets and how they're going to start pricing in the limits of the conflict. Is it going to start pricing that this is a long war? Or is it going to start pricing that this is World War III? Or is it going to start pricing that those that know what's going to happen next, or those that are betting big money on what's going to happen next, are the ones that really go beyond the talk? Because the market tells us what the market is thinking as well. So I'm going to be diving deep into all that. and going through the limits of the conflict, and that really this is not just bombs and missiles at this phase anymore. It is really, about energy systems and infrastructure and what it means when certain energy systems and infrastructure are closed down. Then you need to look at what the media is covering, what the media is not covering, and what the alternative routes are, and how that's being factored into the market. So, really, then it becomes what are the supply chains telling us? What impacts, what second, third, fourth, and fifth degree impacts come from this? And we can tell by looking at the financial markets, we follow the money, as we always do. And so the question that the market is trying to ask right now and have answered is this a total global breakdown, as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz certainly can be and is? Or is this a controlled and managed crisis based upon this managed transition to a multipolar world that I believe is predominantly being fed and executed by the financial industrial complex in cooperation with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and China, that also has influence over the more pragmatic elements of the IRGC and the reformist elements of the Iranian government. On the other side, you have the military industrial complex, which is aligned with the neocons in America, the more hardliner elements of the IRGC, and radical Zionist warmongering within Israel. Those are the two different factions of power. I believe that finance wins in the end because they control the flows of capital, and they have negotiated a big theatrical war that also leads to lots of profits and very key strategic goals being met, while the military then goes over to its next conflict zone in compensation, and the financial industrial complex moves into the profiting from the build back phase. And so this week, really, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively the center of the crisis. Now, there was lots of talks around whether it can be closed, whether it's not closed, whether the insurance markets closed it, what happened after that, and I covered all of that last week as well, and be covering this week. But effectively, let's just recap. What is the significance of the Strait of Hormuz? Well, basically, 20% of all global oil normally flows via this strategic choke point that relies upon two countries, mainly Iran and also Oman. And then there are naval fleets there from all sorts of countries trying to protect their interests, whether that be the Qataris, the Saudis, the Americans, the Brits, the French, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Japanese, the South Koreans, because all of those, the Indians, rely upon the safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz without disruption. If that doesn't happen, that impacts energy, but also liquefied natural gas, which is obviously electricity. But on top of that, there are also the fact that LNG is a vital part of petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, and so that impacts the healthcare industry. And the initial market reaction was really focused on oil price spikes. And it was a wild market in terms of volatility. It really hit a panic level incredibly fast. And so what we had was oil, which previously was leading up to this war. It was around about the low of in the mid to late 50s. It went up to the 60s, and then it started as the war progressed going into the 70s. But immediately after the Strait of Hormuz, when the information was processed and the realization that America couldn't stop it, we had a peak price over the weekend where the futures market priced oil at $115. So it gapped up while the stock markets gapped down. We had the Asian markets, which were in the circuit breakers kicked in South Korea because of those energy reliant supply chains, as well as the vital components and rare earths behind what's needed for the semiconductor chip manufacturing industry, which then has impact on military, on AI, on electric car vehicles, on all and pretty much everything, electronics, consumer electronics, laptops, computers, phones, absolutely everything. But we suddenly had a sudden reversal this week. And it fell and crashed very dramatically down to about $89. And there were lots of announcements and lots of things in between, and lots of financial weapons that were fired in order to try and get that price down. So, what this initially did is it set a price ceiling at which price the markets consider it unacceptable, where they will use extreme measures to try and get the price down. This was a $26 collapse in one of the most liquid markets in the world. I mean, oil is really the backbone of the entire economy. If oil and energy and LNG don't flow, then the world as we know it grinds to a halt. It's all priced in dollars, with the exception of those that have been going through a de-dollarization campaign at the moment. But the fact that there was a $26 collapse in 3 days and the bulk of it happened very quickly, this was the largest price increase and decrease in the history of oil markets. That's how extreme this was. And so it hinges really in the historical prices of previous conflicts and what the price went up to. We've had peaks of about $135 on previous crisis, whether it be the Russia Ukraine conflict, whether it be the 1973 oil embargo during the Yom Kippur War, where Saudi Arabia constricted supplies as a result of Israel escalating the war. Whether it be the important point here is that we need to determine what real money is doing. Is real money exiting and placing crisis trades, or are the markets kind of signaling the limits of what they think this will be based upon insider information and kind of their understanding of what the war is and how long it will last? But then we've basically set this week an oil price ceiling based upon the escalation ladder that we saw this week. And what that means is that Iran attacked the US military bases, and then there were, taking out of, everything, all of the infrastructure that is needed in order to provide Israel's dominance in the region when they're executing their operations alongside the United States for the military industrial complex, the MIC. We also had strategic targets. Now, we don't know what was false flags. We don't know who potential candidates for false flags could be, but we do know, and we're going to answer, who benefited the most. And really, we can look at Russia, Israel, and US as potential false flags. Iran was retaliating to US and Israeli aggression. Then there was the immediate reaction from Iran that targeted the US military bases across the entire region, including the Gulf countries. And then there was also a targeting of Oman, not on Oman as a sovereign nation or not on the Gulf countries as a sovereign nation, because they never retaliated, because they knew they were targeting US military bases. And the Oman side was to make sure that there was no alternative route through the Strait of Hormuz. And so by shutting off the Oman part, Iran had the full negotiation card and negotiation tactic, and we had the market reaction, and then we had a time frame of everybody that benefits from the closure to realign, put together their negotiations based upon the leverage. But as soon as oil hit above 110 to $120, we had massive intervention in order to try and reach this key equilibrium zone. So we know that right now, when there is LNG closed, where Qatar closed its production, when there is, kind of some targeting, whether it be false flag or not, of Saudi oil fields without destroying massive infrastructure. And by closing the Strait of Hormuz, we know that once oil hits $120, 115, $110, there is the desire and need to intervene because it becomes counter to the escalation cycle. Now, the tools that you have in order to execute that diminish over time. Some of those tools were Trump just make an announcement, the war's about to come to an end. It looks like we've reached an end to the conflict, and a post on Truth Social. But as it doesn't happen, and as it didn't happen, that enters into the taco trade. You know, Trump always chickens out. And so as the taco trade becomes more normalized, the boy who cried wolf effect kicks in, and it becomes a tool that no longer works that effectively. But True Social was, where Trump was posting, and that really had an impact based upon that. Then there were real tools, not just optics. So you had the media, you had the announcements, you also had a reaction from Western G7 aligned, countries, and they all have strategic petroleum reserves. And some countries will have to use their strategic petroleum reserves, but everybody started hoarding. Energy prices go up through the roof. Everything had a reaction. And there was an announcement from the G7 countries that they're getting ready to deploy approximately 400 million barrels. So that was another tool that was used in order to drain those strategic petroleum reserves. That's what it's actually for. In fact, America was going to be draining, based upon the announcement, 41% of its strategic petroleum reserves. But it still wasn't as big as what happened during the Russia-Ukraine war from Biden when he drained all of the reserves, and it got so drained that he had to run over to the Middle East, beg MBS to release some oil. And because the Biden administration didn't help Saudi previously, when the Trump administration struck Qasem Soleimani, and Iran reacted by targeting oil fields in Saudi Arabia via the Houthis, and MBS wanted America to get involved. Biden didn't get involved in that. And therefore, MBS decided to favor and work with OPEC Plus and Russia. That created a spike in oil prices before. Remember, the Fed very famously said this is transitory, inflation is transitory. That led to a spike in interest rates later when inflation wasn't transitory. People were queuing, people were choosing between eating and heating, prices went through the roof. And it also had cascading effects on the banking market because there was that duration risk where essentially a bunch of banks had very low interest rate bonds that were the backbone. Peter Thiel came up on a space and asked all the Silicon Valley companies to withdraw their money from Silicon Valley Bank, creating a bank run. And then Silicon Valley Bank had to effectively sell all of their bonds to meet the demand for withdrawals. Now, those bonds, obviously, if you're hiking interest rates, then when the government's issuing new bonds, they have much higher yield. Because the yields are going up, it means old bonds, you have to pay a lower price if you're going to buy them on the secondary market. Now, you can hold them all the way to expiry, i.e., a $1 bond. If you hold it for the whole duration, you get the interest plus the $1 back as long as the US repays it. But if you need to sell it in a panic, you get what the market will give you. And now, if interest rates are going up and new bonds are being issued at higher interest rates, then the price of those bonds go down. And this creates a structural balance sheet deficit for the bank, meaning they can't meet their withdrawals. And so that led to Fed intervention, FDIC exposure. It broke a bunch of banks. And then we had even the European banks like Credit Suisse go down that then had to be merged into UBS. And we had to have a big print and a form of QE type of intervention. Now that those dynamics all exist again today. We're starting to see history repeat. We'll go into that. But where do they kick in? Well, they kick in effectively when oil now goes to that point of that 115 and $120 because what other tools did they use? They immediately, there was tools like um, lifting sanctions on Russia so they could sell more oil, intervening with futures markets. So Treasury would use their, trading desk or a covert operation like Jane Street, or something like that, in order to effectively go short the market using futures and options contracts. Now, the problem is that once you have those short suppression, you have a structural short position, and the price of oil has to go down before those contracts expire. Otherwise, you enter into a liquidation cycle where you borrowed some oil in order to sell it short to suppress the price. And then as those contracts reach expiry, if the price is very high, then you either lock in a loss and if the price is low, then you make a profit and the suppression worked. But if we get some kind of action that spikes the price, then you have to pay any price in order to cover that short position, which is why the price then spikes up if those operations go wrong. So the more of this action happens, it either means that there's going to be a bailout to cover those positions, or it means that effectively they have some kind of information or some belief that by the time those contracts expire, the price will be lower, which means that the conflict has come to some kind of negotiation or decisiveness at that phase. So there is a real and genuine time frame on that. But once the price goes higher, they do whatever is required to get it down. Why? Because there will be an inflation shock, just like I described that happened last time during Russia-Ukraine. There would be a political backlash as countries are moving to elections, strategic reserves are kicked in. Countries like Thailand had to actually close and tell people to work from home. Now, people are remembering the lockdown from COVID cycle as well. And so people are saying, please preserve energy, work from home. That has a big political, ramification, particularly the Trump administration moving into midterm elections. He has legal issues, impeachments, if he doesn't win the midterm elections. So does that all kick in? Also, demand destruction. One of the ways of getting prices down is to make prices so high that no one can afford them. When nobody can afford them, only the wealthy people purchase, and the average people just choose between eating and heating, stop putting their heating in, stay at home, work from home. They find ways of reducing their energy consumption needs, and so do businesses. And that creates demand destruction, which pushes the prices down because less people are consuming it. And it also effectively, what is the market saying right now? Well, the market is effectively saying that the disruption is real. This is a real war, but the system is effectively designed to be able to absorb it. That's what the market is saying at the current, at the current things. The S&P was above 7,000 at new all-time highs. It's now around the 6,700 mark. That's a decrease, but it's not a major decrease. The Asian markets, they had massive gaps downs, and all foreign markets had more dramatical effects than the US market, which reversed that trade. Leading into this, we were getting a weakening of the dollar, where foreign currencies were outperforming the dollar, measured by the DXY, and also foreign stock markets were outperforming domestic US stock markets. That reversed as soon as the war kicked off because the impact is bigger because America is effectively energy independent, but it is the second and third impacts that need to be effectively absorbed here. But the market's absorbing it right now. We haven't had a major crash. Basically, there is some bypass of these different routes that the media is not really talking about right now. But there is infrastructure that is effectively containing the price to a certain degree. And that is alternative infrastructure that exists within the Middle East. In fact, that is something that Saudi Arabia and UAE had. One of those, just to give you ideas on numbers so that we can really measure the real impact, because the whole idea here is that we use the markets, follow the money in order to predict what's going to come next on the war field as well. So there's basically a Saudi east-west pipeline where they're able to get about, it's basically about 750 miles. It goes across Saudi and basically it goes across the Gulf into the Red Sea, which is significant because we've seen during both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, they waged wars on the Houthis in Yemen that said they're not gonna open the Red Sea until Gaza and the genocide ends, and and they kept bombing. Now that led to the Biden administration launching a war against it with a coalition forces, the British forces, the American forces, and really nothing came from that. And Trump did the same, and nothing came from it. So they'd proven through air forces that they couldn't get the Red Sea open. Now, that ended in a truce once the ceasefire happened, and Israel said that it was we had the 20-point plan, and that ended effectively. But that can kick off again. But right now, we haven't seen that happen, which means that the Gulf countries via Saudi are able to get approximately at maximum capacity 7 million barrels per day via this alternative pipeline. Now, this is currently completely full at full capacity and has never functioned at full capacity. It was very much an alternative route. So, this is the first time that Saudi's been able to get 7 million barrels per day at capacity through this alternative pipeline. There are a few other bypasses which are less significant, but really it gives us an indication of why this price of oil is not at $150 or greater. There's something called the UAE ADCOP, and it's basically a pipeline that goes through via UAE. And there is an alternative one as well via the Strait of Hormuz, which is Iran has something called the Iran Gorge pipeline. And that's basically the Gorge to Jack pipeline. And there is also a way of getting oil via these alternative pipelines from Iraq through to Turkey, and then that can come out via the Mediterranean Sea. And so those are the alternative routes. If you combine all these together, from the research that I've seen, you've got a total theoretical capacity of approximately 10 million barrels per day that can route around the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. You could imagine that the real capacity, some experts say, is about 5 to 6 million barrels per day. And so, due to the port limitations and the infrastructure wasn't really at full capacity, particularly in those Iraq routes and those Iran routes, this is the reason why you may not be able to get that pumping at full capacity. But the market implication was effectively that the Strait of Hormuz, prior to its closure, which was closed via an act of parliament, the IRGC said they will enforce it. Then there was the insurance premiums that effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. And to this day, there's still not been any oil tankers or enforcements of that, other than interceptors that were taken down, and then the shrapnel hit some of those naval fleets. So we haven't actually seen a full-blown naval war. So in effect, it was the financial industrial complex in reaction to the announcement that actually led to the Strait of Hormuz. We'll go through a little bit of the detail. But prior to that, there were approximately 20 million barrels per day that were going through. So based upon some of this bypasses of if you can get 6 to 7 million of the 20 million, then they've been able to bypass some of the shock factor, but it doesn't resolve it. This is a temporary solution, and it can't be fixed short term by fixing infrastructure. These are longer term things. However, it really explains why oil is kind of went back down to around this $90 range. and also has a peak of about $150. So the next escalation risk, as we've already hinted at after this, is what happens in the Red Sea. And so if the Houthis are activated, then that is the next phase of the escalation cycle. If you stop and close the Red Sea as well as the Strait of Hormuz, we know that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz brings us to a peak oil where there's mass intervention of $115. And the tools that you can use are depleting because the taco trade is becoming less effective. And so then you're really only left with depleting strategic reserves, which creates risk for the countries that are getting through their strategic reserves. And what is the time frame that that puts on it? Or you've got the opening up of sanctions, firstly on Russia, and then the only one left, which is the negotiation, the opening up of sanctions on Iran. And that really is the crux of the matter of this, what the end result is. Now, the market's saying, because the markets aren't crashing, because gold is flat, because oil's up, because it's being contained, because Bitcoin's up throughout this cycle, that's really, which is, more correlated to the AI trade at the moment. The market's saying that they know that there will be a defined end. And I personally believe the theatrical element of this is that while you have those trying to derail the plan, those that are in charge have already defined the parameters of this and are profiteering from this as well. So anyway, whether we get the opening up of the Red Sea, the closure of the Red Sea, and those Red Sea exports, that would be the next phase of the escalation cycle in order to pressure this towards a negotiation. And that would effectively, you would have to use mass intervention. The futures market positions may lead to some losses that may need to be bailed out. But basically, the ships must pass. If they don't pass, then this is effectively the full closure, and we haven't seen that factored into the market yet. And so the Houthis and whether Iran activates those really is the next phase. It's interesting that it hasn't so far. Now, whether that's an escalation ladder or whether it's going to bypass that escalation ladder, we're going to see whether this happens or not. But effectively, the Strait of Hormuz plus the Red Sea being closed means millions and millions of barrels of oil are removed from the market. And that is really the next escalation ladder based upon everything we've seen so far. So the current scenario is again $110 where we get intervention. And this is based upon being able to circumvent some of these choke points, but not to the full degree. And right now, the strait is not physically destroyed. There's been talks about mines and various other things. That would be counterintuitive. That seems like propaganda. But there's been no confirmed direct tanker strike, as far as we can tell, in the fog of information. There's been accusations, there's been propaganda, but as far as we can tell, those have all been debunked. Now, what is interesting is that the planes, now remember, this is all being fought between Iran, Israel, and then the US bases across the country, across the region. Those are all being fought with missiles and drones in the air. And yet, while we had 20,000 planes cancelled, which impacted the tourism industry, the insurers didn't stop the insurance of the planes. And so planes are still moving and planes are still insured. So why did the insurance industry decide not to insure the passage of shipments in the Strait of Hormuz, but they did insure the planes, despite the risk being similar? And why did Trump not talk about impacting, going at it with the insurers? To me, that implies that the financial industrial complex is strategically having their impact, and they know the defined outcome, and they're also confident in those futures oil positions. because they have an idea on the time scale and time frame of this. And we'll keep watching the market as well. But most of the damage that's happened right now has just been debris from interceptors as well, and some of those missile fragments, but nothing else. And yet, shipping is completely blocked up. This is going to take months, even if it gets open today. And the impact has already been had. There's no changing the impact of what's already happened. Now, there is a negotiation cycle for those that are able to get the safe passage of oil NG to use this moment in order to lock in longer term agreements and take advantage of the crisis. And that is being done right now. Um, and I see when I look at it, and we'll cover it a little bit more, in line with the exact predictions that I've been making around a multipolar world. And so the war risk insurers can really change that, whether they withdraw coverage or whether they continue coverage as well. And then it's about the enforceability that we'll be seeing. Okay. Premiums have exploded to the point where you can't put those passage through. It was like 75% of the entire cargo value. And without insurance, you definitely can't get any of these ships through. It just can't happen because it's too much for a business to actually factor in. So anyway, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed by the financial industrial complex, either reacting to the announcement, but they didn't do that for the planes. And so, how do we interpret that? Is that a part of the coordinated theatrical understanding of markets? Or is that just normal reactions to something that's unprecedented? I'll leave you to decide. But Qatar Airways started to open it up. Emirates Airways, they started operating. Obviously, less people are using those, but they're still able to get the insurance as well. And so, that's what's really closing these strategic choke points. And to me, I think it is buying the time to negotiate some of these alternative second and third effect energy contracts, and also drain the strategic petroleum reserves of the countries, of the GC7 countries. They haven't actually released any yet, to my knowledge, in week two. They've said that they deployed that they were, but just the announcement of doing it is enough to actually create a reaction in the market as well. But if they don't actually do it, again, you get a taco effect on the G7 countries as well. Now, what did they announce? They announced that they're going to be releasing 400 million barrels and they're going to get that ready. Now, let's take a look. What is the impact of 400 million barrels? So the world demand for oil right now is currently 100 million barrels per day. So effectively, if they release 400 million barrels and there's not any of these alternative routes, which of course there are, if you just take the G7 stuff, this is basically only 3 days, 2.7 days of demand, relative to the actual impact it can actually have. So if you look at the August Hormuz disruption, if you get those alternative routes, then effectively that buys weeks. It doesn't buy months. So the strait cannot be closed for months without draining all of those allocated strategic petroleum reserves. And the majority of that is coming from America, which was only half at the rate of what prior to this of what they wanted it to be anyway. And you can't use the oil in Venezuela, and so it's not really fixed by that as well. So it can provide a little bit of a bridge, but it's definitely not a solution if this were to be a long-term war. What about supply chains? They're all affected as well. So it's not just oil and it's not just liquefied natural gas and LNG for electricity. The key industries that are also affected Obviously, we've got energy and oil and LNG, but what about chemicals and petrochemicals, which has an impact and a knock-on effect on pharmaceuticals? It also is the different types of food, fertilizers. This was actually a strategic point for India. It relies upon those fertilizers, also lost its gas, which means that that impacts Indian internal politics because they were trying, there was a, remember those the farmers revolts where effectively India was importing agriculture from America. During the trade negotiation, that went down. Now it needs to probably import those agricultural products, but that impacts the internal farmers. So who is going to be exporting those agricultural products? That's mainly America, as well as the LNG that America will be exporting likely towards Europe because they've only got a couple of choices. When Qatar can't do it, you've only got America and Russia. And obviously, Russia can use that leverage, and America will also use that leverage as well. And so that's why Europe has been the most impacted, and it's been the biggest disaster for America. There's also sulfur and sulfuric acid, which has a disruption in the supply chain, various mining components, and the second and third knock-on effects. Copper, cobalt, as an alternative to silver. Remember, with the price of silver, the big squeeze, we haven't seen the impact of who was on the wrong side of that trade. We saw the Fed switch from QT to QE on the short-term Treasury. We saw distress in the repo markets. And then we saw a massive increase in the price of silver and then a correction back down, a massive volatility. People were looking at, China shut off some of those supply chains, saying that you had to get government permission for the companies in China to export and some of those refining processes. And an alternative was copper. It can't, produce electricity at at the same rate that silver can in terms of efficiency, but copper was looked at as an alternative. So all of these commodities are impacted, as well as cobalt, and the food, the insecurity that we talked about as well. Um, Also, yeah, some of those components inside technology, which impact South Korea. And so that was why there was a big impact in the stock market as well. And that has its impact on semiconductor chips, which is AI. You've got the key strategic points. Taiwan needs oil. They need to produce semiconductor chips. Europe, Netherlands needs, they're reliant upon either the North Sea, which prior to this, the UK, which I don't think is a coincidence, implemented windfall taxes, which had a massive impact on the capacity of the North Sea oil. That made them dependent upon Norway, Russia, Qatar, America. Now those options are being severely reduced as a result of that tax policy as well. So in the AI chain, you've got China, you've got Taiwan, you've got Netherlands, you've got South Korea, and then you've got the American infrastructure. That is, if there's any disruption in that, severe economic consequences as well in the long term. If this carries on for 2 months at this rate, we would be in a ginormous global financial crisis, and we've already seen to start some of the stress points in the market. But industrial metals are also impacted, and there are other sectors that I haven't thought about, but those are the main ones as well, and we'll start to see that. Obviously, we've had impacts in aviation. Jet fuel is at its all-time high at the moment as well. So that has impact as well. And then knock-on effects in terms of tourism. There's been a big drop in tourism to the Gulf countries. That affects, not only shipping and tourism in the Gulf, but also aviation impact as well. The tourism, mainly the biggest impact, of course, would be in Dubai. There has been targeting at both the US military bases and also alleged infrastructure, either via false flag or via Iranian targets, into the airport. And then those interceptors have had disruptions where shrapnel would fall onto hotels like the Burj Al Arab, And then obviously tourists are going to just say, well, we'll sit this one out until we know what actually happens. Then you have Doha, Qatar, Abu Dhabi in UAE, Saudi as well, Riyadh, and flights are still operating, but the participation is down as a result of this shock in terms of the industry as well. So Gulf effectively take a hit in that sense. Plus, they got the reduction in LNG and oil sales because they're using the alternative routes at capacity. But the price of oil and price of LNG is going through the roof as well. So what they are selling is at a bigger impact. And as we've covered as well, if those US bases are being targeted, they get to demonstrate that the US was effectively occupying their region, not providing protection, using that in order to provide intelligence to Israel for some of those operations that helped the US military industrial complex agitate the region. If those are gone and destroyed, they get to be renegotiated. The optics is perfect. The people will ask about it. And we've already started to see renegotiations between UAE, South Korea. We've already started to see impacts in terms of renegotiations with China and Russia. And really, it helps make that managed transition where effectively the US has a much smaller footprint in the industry in the Middle East, which is in line with that multipolar world and the Middle East going eastwards and becoming West Asia as well. Um, so anyway, they can try and make up for some of this, but have no doubt this short term is very disruptive. And also, they reacted by pulling back some of their AI and defense investments in America. And if you look at the AI trade and the investment in data centers, America would have very low growth last year if it wasn't for that. That relies on both the private credit markets, as well as a functioning stock market, as well as the Gulf sovereign wealth funds as well. So, um, right. The big impact, as we covered last week as well, is European energy. They're incredibly vulnerable, and some of the Asian countries are incredibly vulnerable. Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Bangladesh, some of the Middle Eastern countries like Jordan, Egypt, where their LNG supplies have been cut off by Israel. You have Europe, which is incredibly dependent, India as well. So these countries need to renegotiate terms. Now, after the Russia UK anti war rhetoric, how easy is it going to be for Europe to renegotiate some of those LNG supplies? Well, they were buying, LNG from Russia throughout this whole war while effectively saying that they were sanctioned. But Europe effectively pivoted as much as it could from Russian gas to Qatari gas and liquefied natural gas imports from both America and Qatar. And so when Qatar then cuts its production, you've only got US left and Russia left. And then obviously anything you can get via some of these Norwegian oil exports as well. And so the Hormuz closure impacts Europe greater than anyone else. And so this is the most likely sign that either America or Russia will use it for leverage in terms of its negotiation over Ukraine, and America will provide a counter to that. And they'll try probably say, well, if you don't want to go to Russia, you're going to need to lock in some long-term contracts for us. And Trump will say, yes, we're here to provide energy security for our friends in Europe, of course. That will be on incredibly predatory terms, as you would expect. And so the result of that is basically, you get energy diplomacy, and that has an impact on the Russian side and the American side as well. And who is the victor of all of this? Without a doubt, even in the Western Hemisphere, that side of the multipolar world, Russia is the victor. Now, US, while it's taken advantage of for its private sector interest, remember the US is controlled and owned by the financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, and technical industrial complex. Financial industrial complex sit on tops, and oil and energy routes are a part of that infrastructure. So the US can effectively negotiate contracts to make transnational capital more powerful. The US becomes more subordinate, and Europe becomes more subordinate to US private sector interest. That completes the project of vassalizing the Western Hemisphere into full command and control by the financial industrial complex if it wasn't enough already. Now, that also sets the border between the multipolar world, which Russia can set, because what's Russia doing? Russia immediately went out to help its neighbors across the entire world, including Asia. Now, imagine if you're Russia and you were the most heavily sanctioned country in the world, as was Iran, and immediately you get some sanctions relief in order to contain the crisis, which shows the extreme measures that the US is willing to go to in order to contain that price. Then you've gone from selling at a discount at $35 or so, whatever it may be at the lowest, maybe it was $40 or more at the discount, we don't know, to approximately $100. That is a ginormous boost to the Russian economy, to its strategic reserves, and it is de-dollarized. So none of that is going to go into US treasuries. That's all going to go likely into, because they've already got their energy, they've already got their reserves, they already can print their own currency. So where are they going to put that? They're going to put that into gold, and they're going to put that into commodities, and they're going to put that into fellow investments into the purchasing imports from China. So that draws Russia and China closer. It creates dependency on Russia to the Asian counterparts, and it supports the Russian economy to really set that BRICS corridor. Now, while the GCC are working at lower capacity, and the GCC wants to negotiate the alternative to their US bases, Russia can use that card in order to remove the GCC countries from the US security agreements. The GCC are then holding back on their investments in AI infrastructure, which is what's propping up the growth in America and the US markets, while they're making up for that by doing LNG sales, but that's for the private sector. So you imagine that to manifest in the stock market, which is what's preventing a major market crash because defense contractors are cashing in as well as the oil and energy, whereas everyone else suffers. But it will start to have bigger and bigger impact if the price of oil keeps going up. And it's really, at the moment, at the time of this recording, it's been about those $100. So that gives higher revenues to those private corporate interests in America and Russian national interest as well. So $100, they don't mind if this goes on for as long as possible from the Russian perspective, because they don't have any knock-on effects. This is just pure win for Russia. America, it has impacts on their financial markets, which is why they go into Russia in order to get the oil price down. This gives Russia all the negotiation chips as well. So US effectively announced that they're on a limited and minimal time frame. Scott Bessent announced that they're going to remove some of the Russian sanctions around oil that was in the sea. There was record levels of oil on sea leading up to this, which is why China, Russia, and various other forces, a lot of people knew about it as well, because we had record numbers of oil on sea. China had been building up record reserves in order to ride this one out. And Russian oil shipments effectively have already started moving and they're already starting to ease the pressure. That's what really dropped the price from that 115,000. You had the taco announcements from Trump, you had the G7 announcements, but what really moved, what really made a difference, everything else is theoretical, was actually those Russian shipments moving and the sanction relief. So Russia's cashing in and Russia's controlling the price at the moment. And this was effectively as a result of Russian, barrels being able to stabilize the market and their already existing infrastructure that was only stifled by sanctions, which is why NATO escalated the war with Ukraine, and why the CIA blew up Nord Stream pipeline, and why we had all these secondary effects where BlackRock was doing ESG policy, leading to the destruction of the manufacturing base in Germany, leading to the shutting off of nuclear energy, leading to the dependency and the destruction of Europe and the debt crisis that it's going through right now, all leading up to this. Um, so anyway, we've already seen that Europe has already bought more LNG from Europe while engaging in those negotiations. This is massive leverage, and it also shows you the theatrical element of everything. Just take a step back for a second. America cannot construct a drone, a missile, an F-35 fighter jet, anything while they're being massively depleted right now in terms of their supplies with all of these wars. But they can't produce anything without China. If China stopped exports tomorrow, the US military industrial complex can't replenish their supplies. Uh, America imports highly enriched uranium for their nuclear program, part of it from Russia. Europe imports its LNG from Russia. Think about that for a second. That's how you know the theatrical element of this and the proof of weapons network is managing these big events in order to reset the world order right now. Because if this was World War III, if any of these escalated to genuine, non-agreed negotiations where world leaders had agreed on the outcomes that they're pushing towards, with obviously elements of disruption along the way from previous powers, then that would be a real war. That would be an embargo, which during World War II, you had Pearl Harbor, you had the oil embargo, and then you had the atomic bomb blowing up. That's a real war. That's what it looks like in reality. What we're seeing right now, I believe, is still agreed negotiated outcomes based upon the power dynamics that I'll be covering in part two. And I'll go through all those different powers. And the clown of thinking is just Iran, US, Israel in a war, when you have to understand the factions of power within each of America, Israel, and Iran, and obviously BRICS and also GCC to understand what the real war is. We'll be covering that in part two with the interview anyway. So anyway, the energy map is splitting the world up into multipolarity. This is the global reset. This is the execution of the outcome. It started with tariffs when Trump was installed because China had won the trade war, and Trump created Dollar Liberation Day to reset all of the negotiations. And then ever since then, we've had the different theatrical phases going into the effectively October the 7th lies around what that operation was. The failure of the complete ethnic cleansing and genocide because Egypt didn't allow for the border to open and didn't take the IMF bribe. Then that led into the regime change from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. Then we had the Houthis that executed the ceasefire agreement. Then we had the 12-day war, which was the narrative for Trump to say, here's a Hollywood movie, how we took out the nuclear program. Israel to go back after they depleted all of their defense and the Iron Dome. And Iran effectively took out key strategic points. For Israel to say we took out the head of the snake. And then, of course, on the Iran side, to do not a regime change, but take out a bunch of IRGC hardliners that weren't on board with China's plan for regional stability, and then we entered into this phase, which is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the taking out, the attempted regime change, which failed because it wasn't met with military coup. Revolutionaries only match when they can take over the army. So then you had that theatrical element that led to the military buildup. And then you had the strikes from America, effectively raging an illegal war and invasion on Iran. That then led to the destruction of the US bases in the Gulf countries, and also more taking out of hardliners in Iran, while there was a simultaneous negotiation, and everybody that was at the negotiation table within Iran is alive today. Whether that be IRGC members, in whether that be the reformist, pragmatic government members, and we'll go through those. And then it takes us to where we are right now, the Strait of Hormuz close. Then you get the renegotiation in line with a multipolar world. You get the oil price that is being contained in order to strategically manage those transitions, reset the world order. And we know that this can't go on long term because it breaks everything, which is why gold has held as if this isn't World War III. Oil has gone up, and markets have only corrected to a small degree in the US, but a bigger degree in the other countries that the renegotiations are happening with. And so Europe is effectively now a US LNG dependent, depending on sanctions relief on the Russian side, which builds the Western Hemisphere. And Asia, for now, while the Strait of Hormuz is closed, is a Russian oil and gas dependency, and they need full dependency on Chinese exports. So really, that GCC BRICS corridor means that effectively the Middle East, which was a term that was created by British colonizers and French colonizers because they were looking east and considered it the middle. But prior to that, it was a part of Asia and it was called West Asia. And you had the Ottoman Empire that led to Sykes-Picot, the breaking up of the Middle East, the installation of, British and French, oil exploitation and leadership and monarchy structures. And then we've had the rise of China that has made some of those changes. They had the forever war model, where the US effectively made sure the Middle East was always at war. And then you would have, the installation of the Soviet Union by the same people that installed the Federal Reserve, by the same people that transferred gold from the Bank for International Settlements to the fascist Nazi regime in Germany, funding all sides of that so that you could get Russia's war, transfer all the gold over to Fort Knox, and then do Balfour Declaration in order to create the Zionist entity that became a division for the US military industrial complex post World War II in order to continually agitate war, so that you could enforce, that you could get that war, create the petrodollar. Whenever there was a war to attack the petrodollar, it led to assassinations in Saudi Arabia after the oil embargo. And then you entered into the fiat currency standard when effectively US defaulted on its debt by removing the convertibility into gold and removing the ability for European and American bonds to be repaid to Russia when they sanctioned the money in the 2022, and the de-dollarization knock-on effect that's happened ever since. All of that has led to this new world order where America is trying to show strength while it shrinks. And Russia emerges as the economic winner as a result of week two of the Iran war. So what comes next? What did the financial markets actually do? So basically, what the stress appears to show us, just as a recap as well, is that the energy shock has basically split into various different factions in finance. The key issues is that we saw at the same time stress in the private credit market. Now, this could be coincidence because I don't think they're impacted. But let's work through what is the private credit market. The private credit market was previously a way for institutional investors to provide business capital, business lending, receive higher yields like 10% returns as a result of banks really focusing on real estate, mortgage-backed securities, and retail credit cards and mortgages and loans. But that they didn't want to lend to business, so private credit kind of took that market where high net worth investors would invest in funds with fund managers in order to invest in private credit. Now, when you're lending to a business or investing in private equity, that's a long-term time frame. It can be like up to 10 years for private equity, but it can be on set terms for whatever the business goal is um, for for private credit. Now, if that's being invested in AI data centers, many of these AI data centers, they don't have a revenue model right now. So it's like debt that is long-term capital that isn't going to produce a return because this is a longer-term capex infrastructure play. And so the private credit markets decided to do a couple of things. Firstly, they opened up to retail. Now, retail don't have the level of sophistication normally to understand what they're investing in because they're not professional full-time investors. They just see that they could get out of it within 3 months if they wanted to, but there were terms that led to force majeure. Force majeure is when there is exceptional circumstances you can default on the contract. And one of these is exceptional circumstance that they're saying a breakout of a war has led to force majeure. And so now those retail investors can't get their money out in the next 3 months. So what are the private credit investors doing? Well, they're trying to facilitate those withdrawals. So they called force majeure, they suspended the withdrawals, and now they're trying to sell those assets in distress to probably the vulture capital and private equity industry. And they could end up flipping those, or they could dump them on pensions because part of the policy of the Trump administration was to open up 401ks to private credit, private equity, more exotic products, and also crypto as well. And so there may be an environment of dumping those on pensions, but the stress is starting to be felt. And so at the extremes, some of these private credit products are selling at 14 cents on the dollar to try and get some liquidity. That's the price at which the market and sophisticated investors are willing to pay to unblock some of these withdrawal demands. So it doesn't have an impact on who is underneath all this, which is the mortgage-backed security markets, the 10-year treasuries, the bank loans that are behind a portion of this. So effectively, is backstopped by the bank because all of these institutions, private equity firms that are providing the capital up, they've been borrowing through leveraged buyouts and various other things. So the market is leveraged, it's just very hard to see it as a result. And so, as I said, now, what was a bunch of this? This was the AI trade and the data center trade. A bunch of the companies that they were invested in are being disrupted by AI. Software as a service companies that had that cash flow that can help you receive dividends, that can meet your demand for withdrawals in some of these private credit funds, they're going belly up. They're the ones that are impacted by AI disruption. So the value of those assets are going down, leading to more and more mark-to-market write-downs, which was the issue that happened with the mortgage-backed securities. And you're looking at the insurance market via credit default swaps. You're starting to see some of these insurance premiums as well show significant signs of distress. And so the US recent growth market was as a result of these private lending markets. It was non-bank credit that was driving a bunch of the growth. It was capital funding through private equity that was driving a bunch of these growths, leading to pre-IPOs and a bunch of the AI companies that are set to go public this year, like OpenAI and ChatGPT, Anthropic, and others. And that needed the build out of the AI data centers. So the infrastructure play is now suffering stress because now the Gulf countries use that leverage to say we'll renegotiate our terms on many of those investments. Remember Trump? He's always bragging $18 trillion of inbound investment. We've got the hottest economy in the world. Well, that's foreign direct investment and private credit markets domestically, as well as some of the corporate venture plays that's putting up some of that investment. And so the Gulf sovereign wealth funds have now got a negotiation chip as well. They can pull out of their purchases of equity unless this comes to a fast halt. And remember, the sovereign wealth funds have been effectively using their negotiation to co-op BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard and join the financial industrial complex so that they can place influence over the military industrial complex, which is why I believe this is still a transitional war. So during week two, what did we have? We had major institutions that were restricting their withdrawals. We're talking creme de la creme. We're talking BlackRock. We're talking JP Morgan. We're talking Deutsche Bank. And so that started to look like optically another crisis that creates fear. What do the retail investors do? They say, give me my money back no matter what. They try to get it out at any price. The institutional investors start trying to sell off at a discount. They start to write down the value of these assets. And what can they do? This was stress that already existed prior to the market. So now they can use this opportunity to write down and basically write down those losses and blame it on force majeure and other impacts. And so I think they're cashing in on that opportunity. And so the media is creating a bit of a frenzy around these withdrawals that looks a bit like a bank run at the moment. And so again, they can effectively, the crashes create the optics of a financial crisis. It looks like a bank run. And remember what we covered earlier around Silicon Valley Bank. Now, what is being impacted? What market? Well, the bondholders are saying, I want higher yields in order to lend to the US government. So we started to see since the war started, while the dollar's been strengthening, the yields on those long-term treasuries, 10-year, 20-year, and 30-year bonds have been steady rising. This increases the interest on the debt. It creates more financial pressure. And the higher the dollar goes in terms of strengthening, that reverses the trade of weakening the dollar in order to create fiscal dominance, roll over the debt. Now it's got to be rolled over at higher rates to prop up the stock market so that you can effectively do fiscal dominance and devalue the dollar through inflation. Now you've got inflation plus supply chains plus oil. So Trump's obviously going around like a headless chicken saying, don't worry, this is temporary, it's worth it, and we'll get prices down. Now, the second the Strait of Hormuz opens, oil's going to crash probably below rates that we've seen before. But they know, somebody knows the timing on that. And that's because I believe the financial industrial complex is aligned with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, who's aligned with China, and China's exerting influence in terms of the reformist factions and also the IRGC elements that were sat around the negotiation table, while Israel and America take out some of the hardliners and you create a Operation Ajax 2.0 to make the monarchists think that you're going to actually have a regime change. You won't have a regime change, but you create the optics of replacing Khamenei with Khomeini, which gives the optics for the off-ramps that may be potentially happening, and what I believe we are leading to as well. So all at the same time, you have what looks like a US debt crisis encroached. You have the 10-year treasuries, the cost of the debt going up, the 20 years and the 30 years, and gold isn't really going through a spike. And so this is basically meaning that the cost of refinancing the debt applies vassal pressure on US by bondholders. And it also implies vassal pressure on US by the private credit financial industrial complex. it also implies vassal pressure on US by the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. This is why I believe that the US military industrial complex is effectively a for rent militia for the financial industrial complex, the FIC, at this stage. We'll be covering more about that in part two. And we got the narrative framing that essentially we have financial instability by the price of oil, as well as an inflationary spike and everything that can happen as a result of force majeure and not opening the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that can lead to, if this goes wrong, a real oil short squeeze, where some of those contracts push the price of oil up significantly, and that can break a lot of things. And that was just like we saw in silver, and we still don't know who's on the wrong side of that trade. So the only thing this ends with eventually is the straight opening, a deal which has significant concessions, a three-way victory, and also in the US, a big print. This will be a ginormous print in order to devalue the debt, return to the weakening of the dollar, return to the capital outflows, and return to the multipolar trajectory of dollar weakening and turning America into a regional power. But this has accelerated it significantly. So this really is, I believe, in my estimation, the hidden financial reset is driven by financial industrial complex and that faction that we'll cover in part two. And there is a ginormous opportunity for those that want to capitalize upon the crisis. And that tends to be with those aligned with the finance houses and those that control and can move their energy, which to a degree is US, but mainly Russia at the moment. And the private credit exposure gets to do their write downs. Some loans become unprofitable. You can blame it on force majeure. And then you can get back to data credit financing with negotiation leverage with the sovereign wealth funds at the moment, as well as the private credit markets. Um, um, okay. So that's what I think we're seeing by following the market right now. Now, what was the other thing? Right. I wanted to discuss some potential predictions on timing in terms of off-ramps exit. If this was a real war, the markets would be reacting differently, as I said, if there weren't key players in the FIC that know the outcome here, and the timing of the outcome. This can't lead to an all-out victory by Iran, despite the fact that they're actually embarrassing Iran, Israel, and America right now in terms of their asymmetric warfare with their superior technology with drones, ballistic missiles. But they're being very strategic about it, and the press and Trump is giving you a clown story around what's actually happening here. But the timing of this becomes something that I've been predicting long term. I originally thought it would be a 12-day theater, but it looks like they're doing major, major escalation. Now, remember, I covered that, what a theater actually means. It doesn't mean the bombs aren't real. It doesn't mean the casualties aren't real. It means this is a managed transition with global powers agreeing on the outcome and then alternative powers trying to disrupt the plan. I'll cover that more in part two in deep detail. So what's the timing? Well, in April, we have the China summit. At the China summit, this is effectively when Xi Jinping is going to be meeting with Trump. And I think this will be the end of the managed transition. This is where you get the agreed outcome of the trade war, which had already been won, which had already led to Liberation Day as the execution of the managed transition and the theatrics we've seen ever since. But all of this is unfolding right before that. And so I'm expecting Xi Jinping and Trump to have that meeting in China. I don't see a set of circumstances where Iran and Iran has a victory and that leads to the expulsion of Israel. I don't see a scenario where Israel and America destroy Iran and get a regime change. I don't see a scenario where this is a long-term war, like either the disruption of Syria or trying to create a government like Iraq, or a military-industrial complex forever war profit model like Afghanistan. Don't see any of those as likely outcomes. And so, really, the only thing that can come from this is concessions and a deal, which I think was already negotiated. And this war was part of the negotiations as well. So, what is the feasible, themes that we can actually get here? What's the summary? This is the managed transition to a multipolar world order. It's been done accelerated faster than I predicted. And this is going to resolve all the issues as well at the same time. Is resetting the energy flows. We've got the global financial reset that can happen from any impact on the US markets. But the gold signal is saying that this isn't going to escalate to World War III. So what we have seen so far, oil up, gold up and flat to a degree. But you know, what should really happen in World War III? There should be a ginormous flight to gold, and there would be, moving up to $6,000 gold, $7,000 gold, $8,000 gold, up to even $10,000 gold as this progresses. We should have oil prices above $150 if there weren't those interventions. But instead, we're getting oil up, gold flat, and Bitcoin up, which is a high beta play on the AI trade at the moment, because people haven't realized that it's a self-custody trade until you get mass force majeure, and things like that. So the meaning you can say is that the market right now is pricing just for an energy shock, but not a systemic collapse of the private credit markets or a systemic collapse of any of the markets as a result of World War III. So the markets expect an off-ramp. And I believe that already there may be a bit more to be achieved. But if you look at it objectively and sit back, I think many of the strategic objectives have already been achieved in this. What is the strategic objectives in those factions of power that might be negotiating? Well, each actor has basically achieved something that they can go back that doesn't cause civil unrest, gives a narrative that is needed, just like we had in the 12-Day War, but effectively resets all the things that I said are trying to reset. So what does the US get out of this? Well, they get effectively the narrative that they degraded the nuclear program, they decapitated all the infrastructure optics, they basically weakened Iranian air defenses. They'll just declare victory despite what the reality is. Those things have been weakened, there's no doubt about it. But they'll just declare it anyway, and Iran could continue this because much of that infrastructure is deep buried in the mountains as well. So you get all of that narrative, but also Trump gets to say we were strong, we didn't create a ginormous war. And I think he'll want a Hollywood movie like last time where he gets to kind of show and have a public demonstration that he can take back to MAGA. And he can say, we achieved it, we crushed it, Iran capitulated, and guess what? We got a deal done. Israel basically needs to go back and say that they annihilated and decapitated the Iranian proxy networks, and now our borders are secure. So they can say our borders are secure in Lebanon by what is happening with Hezbollah at the moment. The government is meant to be engaging in de-weaponization as a result of that. You can say the borders are controlled in Syria. They could say they overthrow the Assad regime. We protected our borders in Syria. And we've already started to see that there is a GCC puppet, ex-ISIS, in charge. That's pushing Turkey's interest. And there's a placeholder government to achieve regional stability. So you get the exit off ramps. basically all the lies that Israel said when they were a disruptor for the military industrial complex, they can say that they achieved their goals. They get to say we took out Hamas in Gaza. We've now got the 20-point plan by the Trump administration. The Gulf countries can fund that plan contingent upon additional concessions around who owns it, what the routes look like, US exit from the region, Palestinian statehood. Iran can pull their leverage points as well. And effectively, China normalized between Iran and the Gulf countries and Saudi in order to achieve a resolution to the Palestinian cause and a US exit from the region. All of that can be achieved if we have an off-ramp narrative. Um, I believe in Israel, you have an internal power transition. We're starting to see questions around Netanyahu, his family, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, the ones that are more radicalized extremists. In America, we start to see Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, all these different types of people stamp out the radical neocon Zionists and expose it for what it is. Lindsey Graham is looking like a cartoon character. Ted Cruz is looking like a cartoon character. All of these old neocon dinosaur fossil fuels that say we must stand by Israel. We had the Mike Huckabee interview. We saw the Christians exposing how Israel treats the Christians, how they spit on them, all that stuff. So all of this points towards a regime change within Israel that will be leftist aligned, that will be a GCC Turkey puppet, that will have to normalize based upon China's plan, with the plan that China set forth between the Gulf countries and Iran, with the financial industrial complex. Iran gets to do a political shift while maintaining the optics of we prevented a regime change. Now, you can see some of the elements that happened in week two. One of those was on March the 7th, Pezeshkian, which is the I forget whether it's president or prime minister, effectively the reformist government in Iran, that needs to get sign off from the IRGC and those elements. He gave a speech, and in that speech, you got to be careful with how the words. It implied that the Iranian government, and he can signal to Trump and and other powers, that basically civilian control has been achieved by the government over some of the military assets. That's what the speech and the statement implied. That was on March the 7th. The IRGC basically is showing that the symbolism was that it was announcing that the fire at will elements of the IRGC are no longer here and they have been revoked. And so that signals to the financial industrial complex, to the other factions of power, that there is, a internal change that's happening that can lead to this negotiated outcome. We also saw on March the 8th that the son of Khamenei, the new Khamenei, basically was agreed and installed as the supreme leader. Now, if he gets assassinated, then maybe that implies that he wouldn't have been on board with the plan. If he doesn't get assassinated, then prior to this, I didn't think, if you remember in my predictions, that Khamenei would be taken out. But if Khamenei was already cooperating the father in terms of, this new element, because remember, there was internal change that happened in Iran. There was the helicopter assassination, and there were the arrests that happened with IRG hardliners under the previous leader. Maybe his son is continuing that work. And that work was to get to the outcome that we're witnessing right now. And so we could end up with, some kind of the hardliners signaling that they're ready to move to a negotiation. And this would prove the legitimacy of maintaining the IRGC structure and you have somebody that has to be listened to, which is Khamenei. And so if he agrees the victory was achieved, we did this to Israel, we took out the US bases, and we have a plan for the Palestinian cause, then he can maintain legitimacy with the IRGC. But it would be an IRGC. Everyone that wouldn't have gone along with the plan has already been decapitated. And we've already seen a parallel like this in the past. If you remember, Khamenei, when he ended the Iran-Iraq war, there was a similar thing. The IRGC got to maintain, that type of narrative. IRGC had to listen to the Grand Supreme Leader, and then you had the government underneath as well. So we may be getting a similar things, and that to me still can be the only outcome as a result of this. So the IRGC effectively remains. So this prevents a collapse. This prevents Iran becoming an economic disaster. Only the military industrial complex, the neocons, and the radical Zionists in Israel want that. The financial industrial complex, China, the Gulf countries, and the other factions of power, they don't want that. And so this is likely to be, I believe, on everything we have seen, the final act. I couldn't predict all the details. It happened differently to I imagined it would happen. But I think the end goal and the destination is still completely intact. And the market is telling me that this is heading in the direction that I thought it would head. So there might be one more major event likely. Maybe we get another spike in oil. Maybe we get someone derail it, and so it goes on a little bit longer. But I think the end of this is you need a US strike on a nuclear facility similar to Operation Midnight Hammer that makes the market panic. The sophisticated investors still won't, spike the price of gold. If gold and oil start managing in unison and you get an assassination of the son Khamenei, then this is going on a different path. This is going on a neocon path, and maybe there's more operations to get to the end thing. The FIC will still win, I believe, in the end. But the US strike needs to happen in the nuclear facility. It needs to be like Operation Midnight Hammer. It needs to be dramatical. It needs to be a Hollywood movie. And the purpose of it is to Trump to declare victory once China has done all the work and said, we're moving towards regional stability. Trump gets the credit. Trump needs the visual victory moment. And we need a narrative that effectively said, Trump, we destroyed Iran's nuclear program. And then you have the optics that are needed. And I think that will be effectively the final act of the operation. And then we'll move towards a deal. I'll be covering what happens in week 3. Let me know in the comments section whether you think I'm completely wrong, whether you think I'm right, whether you think that following the money has been a useful thing, whether you think markets are getting things wrong or things right. Let me know in the comments section. I will read them all. I'm predicting that there is going to be a ceasefire in March, and the market is pricing basically that there will be emergence from this, and maybe another oil spike is possible. But I think those futures contracts that have been suppressing the market are not going to end up in a short squeeze force majeure. I think they know that the price of oil at the end of this is going to crash like crazy, and they know how long it's going to take, and they would have set those derivative contracts accordingly. But I think it's unlikely to go above the $115 ceiling. And if it does, I will review this. But all the tools are ready in order to do that. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, maybe there's a plan to drain all of the G7 of their strategic petroleum reserves into this. OPEC supply and Russia, particularly leading OPEC and OPEC plus. This is not long term. This is not going to be Iraq. The Russian sanctions is the other tool that they've got. That could be massive relief, and it could open up into another front. But I don't think it will, because I think the military industrial complex have negotiated that we want the Ukraine-Iran war to continue, and Trump's not allowed to deliver anything there. But the border peace will be doing the negotiations between the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex as they effectively manage in this multipolar world order. And this will be followed by Iranian sanctions relief in the end. And in summary, what happened in week two? Week one was effectively the shock and awe and the damage, and it's saying that we are in a war, and everyone to think that this is going to go on forever. Trump's made a critical mistake, all that type of stuff. The end result, as I said before this, before it even started, that the end result is a weaker Israel financially and in terms of strategic points, ready for acquisition, likely by Indian relationship and UAE relationship of key strategic privatized assets, ready for regime change into a leftist government, and Netanyahu getting his victory, or Netanyahu getting his peaceful exit based upon the leverage that he used. It's going to have a weaker Iran, but the economic opportunity is going to be significantly stronger as a result of the China plan. And that is going to be probably Russian guarantees on enriched uranium, Chinese security guarantees, maybe Turkey and Egypt and Pakistan involved in some of those agreements. The escalation of the 20-point plan in Gaza that leads to the Arab security forces and concessions probably around the Strait of Hormuz for privatized elements of the financial industrial complex in order to tie it together so that the strait doesn't close again in case hardliner factions are able to do this. It will be done over a tiered structure, likely with strategic points, and it will be significantly better and significantly easier to maintain than JCPOA, the previous agreement that Trump tore up. And this will be worse for American interests and significantly better for Chinese interests, the BRICS corridor in general, and the GCC in general. US will not have the constructs that it needs to prop up the petrodollar. It will have a non-military industrial complex funded Israel that's not there to agitate war for the forever war. The US bases will be renegotiated into more favorable terms and a weaker US. US will exit the region in the name of the border peace. And that will be effectively what all of the things that I said that need to happen to achieve peace in the Middle East. Normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, resolution to the Palestinian cause, and the exit of the US. I thought it would take longer. This is accelerating a lot faster than I imagined. And I think it's, if it wasn't for war and tragedy, I think it's very skillful realpolitik that's being executed right here. So in summary, week two, we had the limits of the war revealed in terms of escalation cycles. We had massive disruption from the Strait of Hormuz. We had alternative pipelines that were able to soften the impact. We had no escalation from the Gulf countries on Iran. We had new relationships and infrastructure contracts and shipping agreements that are going to be able to be negotiated right now. We had shipments that US have not been able to get through despite rhetoric. We haven't seen any war in terms of naval ships, but we have seen enforcement through insurance contracts and posturing and various guarantees. We've seen Russia significantly benefit, strengthening its position in the BRICS corridor. We've seen US strengthening the dollar, strengthening its LNG dependencies with Europe, but in terms of leverage, but that doesn't last because we've seen the stress in the financial markets and how it can't handle an increase in the price of oil. And so we get a financial market reset that has to be executed quickly, that can lead to a big print and create the next narrative framework in order to weaken the dollar and return to the fiscal dominant strategy. And really, that is the conclusion of week two. It's still saying to me that despite the fact that I couldn't get the predictions right in terms of all the different details, the trajectory is the same. and I've learned a lot from it as well that I'll be using in future analysis. If you subscribe to my channel, if you like this video, we'll create AI summaries of this on my blog on simondixon.com. You can also make sure you follow me on Rumble. Make sure you subscribe to me if you want to download this as a podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And also follow me on X, where I give the real conflict as well. But I think we're still on track. But this is a managed and a recognition of global routes to usher in this multipolar world. I will keep giving periodic updates, and I'll check in for week 3 in terms of deciding whether something changed it. But I'll be following these pipelines. I'll be following oil. I'll be following these choke points. I'll be looking at the deeper power structures that we're now going to cover in part 2. And so the question I want to answer in part 2, my interview on BTC Sessions, is what if this war is actually really about financial power versus military power, and how do the two work together, and what the impact of that is in terms of the global financial system. So we're now going to head over to part 2, which is my interview with BTC Sessions, and we call this the financial war behind the Iran conflict, and it's my interview on BTC Sessions. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you for part 2 now, and the week 3 analysis next week. Always remember, you're alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get hurt, others are going to get wrecked. I want to make sure that you're on the right side of the change. So enjoy the interview so that we can make this transition with a bit more peace, love, and unity on our side while they're creating the destruction, and make sure you're on the right side. So enjoy the interview with BTC Sessions. Peace. We are not in a war between Iran, Israel, and America. We are in a war between the military-industrial complex and the financial-industrial complex. There's no such thing as America first, because Trump works for his lobby. I think this is the global reset. I think it's a managed transition. When you follow the money, that's what it's saying. I expect that that's going to change the world in April.
All right, Simon, thank you so much for joining me again. I appreciate you coming on last minute. I wanted to get your take on what's going on currently with the Iran conflict, because honestly, for me, it's been kind of all over the map. There feels like there's a ton of fog here. Like, even just looking back, in March of 2025, Tulsi Gabbard came out and said they weren't developing nukes. And then in June, we destroyed the nukes. And now we're back because of nukes. And the Strait of Hormuz is open, but it's closed. And it's nearly complete, but it's going to take into September. So 30,000-foot view, what are you seeing? What is going on from your perspective? How does this fit into your theory that we're transitioning to a multipolar world? And then more importantly as well, who stands to benefit from the U.S. war with Iran, right? Like, where does the money lead us?
Okay. Yeah, we'll take all of those questions individually then, and that will take us the whole episode. So it's great to be back. I seem to always come back when we have these big geopolitical events. I think the last one we did was Venezuela.
Yep.
And then we've done a few more since. So look, this is definitely the big one.
Yep.
So there's obviously we've talked about this proof of weapons network. You have a financial industrial complex that profits from financing wars and then rebuilding. You have a military industrial complex that profits from both war and defense. And then you have a technical industrial complex, which is currently using algorithms as like a new media and new data play in order to, build out our police and surveillance state. And I call that a proof of weapons network in previous episodes, because Bitcoin proof of work is the resistance against it. So when you take that framework, you can really get out of the fog, the cloudy fog of information, and just really stand back and look at this, saying who benefits from this war. And so we can really answer that question. So firstly, you talked about, we've got this big geopolitical transition that I've been talking about for years, that other people believe is happening, which is this transition to a multipolar world. you have an America, the previous empire, which was really a continuation of the British Empire. And now the British Empire and this Anglo-Saxon Empire, as it were, was subordinate to this private financial and global capital. And so over the years, through financialization and securitization, the West has been fully captured. It is subordinate to banks. And through the public markets, banks are able to, or this financial industrial complex, to be more accurate, is able to control the military industrial complex, which underneath it has the concept of a deep state with MI6, Mossad, the colonies, Five Eyes, this type of stuff. And then you have a rising new control grid in the technical industrial complex. And so the concept of a multipolar world is that it used to be that you could use the military in order to gain access to all the resources that you need to subordinate a country so that it would print its own money once you've installed a Western central bank. And it could use that money in order to take over all the resources, regime change a country, install a corrupt leader, and then make sure that those resources come back to prop up the dollar. And that all that money is lent to the US government through the Treasury markets. And so whatever happens at the Federal Reserve level, like if you get some inflation in America, you get it 10 times worse in these countries that are subordinate to the dollar. And so you have the IMF that goes out there to try and enforce these things. Now, this has been done throughout the multi-decade US empire. But we had this trend where, again, I always try to bring it financial and then we'll get right into the geopolitical and the current. You have this trend where effectively this global financial industrial complex would use financialization, securitization, and now tokenization in order to make all corporate interests subordinate to it, as well as use lobbies in order to control the government, and then use blackmail rings in order to control power, judicial, and various other things. Now, what did it want to do when it came off the gold standard in 71, which was a debt default after the Vietnam War? So once it could no longer default, once it could no longer pay, we entered into this fiat currency standard where it was just effectively rolling over a Ponzi scheme, and you didn't need to back it by debt. You just needed to back it by the ability to sell US treasuries, and the financial industrial complex use those US treasuries as collateral to get as many resources as it possibly could. Now, at some stage, you completely hollow out the manufacturing base, which is what happened to America. You had globalization, you had the World Trade Organization, it would bring China into the fold. And then China, through its vast population and currency suppression, was able to build the strongest military base in the world. Think about the British Empire. When there was a Dutch Empire, it was built upon naval ships. The British Empire were able to, they were the cheap labor at the time, and then they copied the technology and built their own naval fleet. And then at the end of that, the Bank of England bankrupted the country. We had World War I, World War II, and America had the manufacturing base that built the military industrial complex. And eventually it was co-opted by the financial industrial complex. Now the military industrial complex is being disrupted by technology and the technical industrial complex. Now, what happened in Iran, for example, is they built a new military based upon drones, based upon cybersecurity, based upon artificial intelligence, based upon military, as did Israel. While America was kind of these big naval ships and, legacy type of finance. And it now turns out that you could take a ginormous bomb that costs millions and billions to produce at scale, and a $50,000 drone is able to just come and take out these ships, take out these missiles. And so we've had this massive technology change. But who was building it all? Well, everyone was using China. And so China had the cheap labor, China had the manufacturing base,
China had all of the rare earth minerals and components that are needed. China had all the commodities, and it became the only country that had all the parts of the equation. So China slowly started to kind of reverse this IMF financial colonization. And China built a manufacturing base and built a Belt and Road Initiative, started building up Africa, started building up the Middle East, started building up different parts of Asia, built relationships, didn't regime change them, didn't take over, didn't install like their puppet leaders, allowed them to have their ideology and allowed them to use some of their resources as well. So China was able to exert more and more influence. You know, America's share of GDP shrunk from 60% to now 25%. And now what happened, because you had this global network of the financial industrial complex that effectively controls the corporate interest, all of the people are in debt, controls the government through bondholders, controls the capital markets through, and controls the media, you're able to just effectively turn America and rent the military industrial complex, almost like a rent militia to go get you resources. And so with that, the growth opportunities of these financial industrial complex starts looking for foreign opportunities. And so they start pushing capital into other countries. They start, through globalization, take advantage of China's cheap manufacturing base. And effectively, their GDP keeps going up. The currency of America keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger because everyone's lending it back to the US government. But it's just taking out the manufacturing base until like the 70% of the economy is service based and most of it is financialization. So it turns into full, pure speculation, currency speculation, and that's kind of where we are. At that stage, you hit a debt crisis, end of empire, and that's kind of where America is, just rolling over its debt. Now, once you hit what we call the fiscal dominance stage, this is the economic and background to then we can understand these wars. You hit a stage where you need to print as much money as possible and spend it back into the stock market. So here's what happens is you burden the American people with all of the debt. The financial institutions receive all the interest. But now it starts to become, problematic in terms of your ability to roll over the debt. So when you get the government to come up with more and more reasons to print money and spend it back into the stock market, and the easiest way to do that is via the military industrial complex. So you get Trump to increase his budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. That goes pumped into military. Military are then able to go and get as many resources as they can. You get as many resources as you can, and you use that in stock value. And effectively, this wealth inequality and K-shaped economy just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And whoever owns the assets ends up with everything. Everyone else ends up with all the debt. And then you try and devalue the debt. And so you devalue the debt by printing more and more money. That then creates more inflation at the end of the cycle. And the sacrifice you need to make is the world reserve currency. So that's what Britain did in World War I, came off the gold standard, various other things. So now you've got this whole macro side. The currency starts weakening, and then that pushes all of that capital that was investing in the strongest currency, lending to the US government. That unwinds all of these trades, euro dollar, petrodollar, Japan carry trade, all the countries that pegged their currency to the dollar. They start having to sell their treasuries. And they're like, well, what do we buy now? We don't want to buy our own currency. We can print our own currency. So they buy gold. And then you have this commodity market squeeze. But this financial industrial complex is not nationalistic. It's global in nature. And so what it does is it co-opted all of the countries that effectively maintained their own resources. And some of those countries are countries that have an independent central bank or a sovereign wealth fund, or countries that nationalize their resources, oil and energy resources. And so if you look around the world, the countries that did that the best in Europe was Norway. So you have the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. You had China that has this ginormous surpluses. You have Japan that has massive debt, but massive surpluses as well. And then you have the countries that have all the energy and were effectively the Gulf countries. So you have the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Kuwait Sovereign Wealth Fund. All of this, which we can call transnational capital, partnered with the Western financial industrial complex, and they're able to set the order. They're able to manage capital flows. They're managed to rent the US military, the most powerful military in the world. And they're able to effectively manage these capital flows. And now it wants that because the returns in America are not what they were, it's resetting the world order. But at the same time, there were sovereign countries that were able to exert pressure against this, which was China. And then you had Russia as well. But China partners with Russia. It's really China. So now you can't, you have massive competition here, which is China. Now they effectively have to negotiate with transnational capital. And so if you look all around the world right now, you got China and Asia. You got the middle, which is the Gulf countries, Iran, Israel. And then you've got America, which is effectively Europe underneath it and Canada and everything there. All of this block is effectively decided we'll put as much of that into the private American liquid stock markets. We'll laden everyone with debt, and we'll create energy dependencies so they become fully dependent. That's one strategy. How do you how do you control Europe? You destroy their energy supplies, and you acquire all of their assets, and you make them buy all your military. You have NATO, various other things, and you create a Western Hemisphere bloc. Now, the resistance here is China, but there's this place in the middle that you need to resolve. Now, historically, you created effectively, you co-opted this Zionist movement. People talk a lot about Zionism right now. Zionism is effectively capital that partnered with Western interest, whose job was to agitate war in the Middle East and create this forever war model. And so by having this, expansive, what's called a Greater Israel project, you use that, you have a religious narrative in order to agitate the region continually. You also have covert operations where you fund groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, various other things, covertly in order to pretend it's a religious battle, but really you're just hiring them as CIA ops and Mossad ops and MI6 ops. At the same time, you need strategic tension. And so if you look at Iran's history, you basically had lots of MI6 ops, lots of CIA ops to take the oil of Iran and stop it being nationalized. So it was the British Empire came along, you have British Petroleum, they took 80% of the revenue and gave Iran 20% of the revenue. You then overthrew the democracy, and you had operations like Ajax, where you would effectively create a color revolution. You would use media. You would put CIA and MI6 ops to kill people, and then you would blame it on the regime, use sanctions and currency war in order to create an economic circumstance to uprise the people. And then you try and create a coup by aligning them with an alternative military, overthrow the government, install your dictator, and then that dictator acts as a Western puppet to make sure that the oil is continually flowing back to Europe and America and the Western Hemisphere. So that's the history. Now, in 1979, you had a revolution. But where did that revolution come from? It was Khomeini, who was just this week taken out, assassinated, or in the last 11 days, I'm losing track of time. Before that, you had Khamenei, which is like a different one. I always get them confused. Very similar names. But he came from exile in France. in 1979. And then you had this effectively Islamist, radicalized, they call it, and all the media painting it as a radical Islamist terrorist and all that type of stuff. But if you read things like the declassified CIA reports on Iran-Contra was an operation that explains how this works. So the CIA was funding in Iraq Saddam Hussein, giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, trying to use the oil resources there. At the same time, America was giving money to Israel. Israel then was taking that money and purchasing weapons from the military-industrial complex and selling them to Iran. So Israel, US, and Iran were all working together in the Iran-Contra. Then Iran built a weapons smuggling network that was going back to Contras, which is like militia groups, you hire mercenaries in Nicaragua that were protecting the US drug trafficking routes, which is obviously done by the CIA. So everything you can see, you can look at what's happening in Mexico right now. You can look at what's happening in Iran, look what's happening in Israel, look what's happening in US, and you can see that operation never ended. And so what you had effectively is an Islamic Revolutionary Guard, IRGC, that came in. And immediately what happened after Iran-Contra, Iraq and Iran went to war. And so you had this 8-day war, and America was funding both sides via the Iran-Contra affair and via funding of the Saddam Hussein, which led to selling a bunch of weapons. So now you have, effectively, you created a militarized economy with a narrative that this is about religion on the Islamic side. You have Israel with the narrative that it's about the Jewish faith and the Jewish religion. But really, they were an outpost for US military. They were funding groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. And then Iran started funding resistance against that. And you built this resistance economy. And that was groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and groups in Iraq, revolutionary side. And that was all after the wars. And so what effectively happened, if you look around here, you had the Gulf countries that were propping up the petrodollar. You had Turkey that was partnering with NATO. You had Israel that was an outpost for the US military-industrial complex. And you had Iran that was funding the resistance economy. And then when you sanction Iran, you create the economic environment whereby you have a government that is crippled and an IRGC that effectively is propping up their own military-industrial complex. That's what's called strategic tension. And so once you have everyone fighting, you even create like fake narratives around like Syria. I don't want to get too complicated because there's no point. But you basically create sectarian division. You say, oh, you're the Shia Muslims, you're the Sunni Muslims. You take those religious ideological differences, you shake them up, and then you start funding militias and say, and you fund this, you fund an aspect of the Shia side, an aspect of the Sunni side. You confuse everything with these ISIS groups and Al-Qaeda groups. And basically you have strategic tension. This is why America ended up with $10 trillion of debt in the Middle East and the propping up of the petrodollar. And so what happens now is based upon all this background. That was a long answer. Hopefully I'm putting it all together. I hope it's clear. You can, you have all this strategic tension. The profit is all the debt ends up with the American people. All the profits end up in the stock market. And you can ensure that the Middle East is never able to unify around their vast resources. Africa's never allowed to unify. When Africa tried to unify and create their own currency, you take out Gaddafi, in Libya. And so, and when Saddam Hussein says, no, we're going to actually price things in euros, you take out Saddam Hussein. You just create a narrative. You just say it's nuclear weapons, it's weapons of mass destruction. So what you need is effectively a narrative for the people to deceive them into thinking something else is happening. You fuel religious tensions to make people think it's a religious battle. And then with that religious battle, you blow up their countries, and then you radicalize people where they think they're joining their religious battle. And so by having, Israel thinking they're in a state for their survival and everyone's trying to kill the Jews, you get the perfect way of recruiting the Jews to the IDF. And so what happens then, you have the IDF that grows, and then they do false flag operations all around the Middle East to take all the Jews that were in Iran, Iraq, and all the other places and force them to go to Israel, grow your population, grow your military industrial complex, make them all join the IDF, and then use that to fuel terrorism and militia, and then hide it all under the media, and then do other false flags, 9/11, various other things. So there you got like the entire history of the makeup. Now, what changed?
Yes.
Well, America needed oil and gas, but under the first Trump administration, they really harnessed fracking and became energy independent. And once they became energy independent, this whole flow of propping up the petrodollar started to get a little bit funky, because now America decided we want to be big oil exporters and gas exporters, to prop up the Ponzi scheme, and keep the debt going at the end of cycle. And so now America starts competing with the Middle East, and China grows. And what do the Gulf countries do? They say, we can't sell our oil to America, but we're selling it to China. And they start building all of this wealth because China grows and grows and grows and grows and takes more of America's GDP. So they're like, well, we're selling all of our energy to America. But, after all of these wars, we ended up with this American base. And that American base isn't protecting us. It's just used in order to agitate the region. Whenever America wants to launch a war, they come and use our base. And so we're telling our people that this protects us. But it turns out that it's just using, US interests. And so slowly China comes up with a de-dollarization plan. We have the Russia-Ukraine war. America confiscates and shows that treasuries are not a good way to store your central bank reserves. Europe takes a bunch of the money. And now we have this rising power. All of the Middle East are dependent. Who else is dependent? Iran's sanctioned. Russia's sanctioned. Who do they sell their oil to? Well, they sell it to China. And they sell it to India. And so BRICS forms, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And the Gulf countries are no longer dependent upon America. So what do they start doing? They say, well, we don't want to buy your debt. We don't want to buy those treasuries anymore. We're going to buy your equities. And so the Gulf sovereign wealth funds start buying the creme de la creme of American equities. And so rather than buying, the debt, they buy the shares. And so now what happens with shares? Well, suddenly, if America's controlled by corporate interest and you're one of the largest shareholders with the financial industrial complex, you're now BlackRock's partner. You're now State Street's partner, Vanguard's partner, Goldman Sachs's partner, JP Morgan's partner. Those were the people that used to try and kill your country and make sure that they could steal your resources. But now they want your money. And so when they need your money, you now are able to exert influence over the private sector that controls America. And so the Gulf sovereign wealth funds were taking Chinese money, selling their oil and resources, building a sovereign wealth fund, and buying all of America's equities. And they were no longer lending it to the US government. So the US government is not getting its debt. It's getting a lot of its military funding from the Pentagon. That's going up and up and up and up and up. That's pushing up the price of stocks. And the Gulf sovereign wealth funds are the investors in those stocks. So now the world order is completely changed. Now China gets to exert influence over Iran, over Saudi Arabia, over the Gulf countries, over Russia, because the sanctions push them to push Iran and Russia to China. And so now they had no choice but to sell their oil to Russia, to China. And China then says, well, if you want me to buy your oil, I'll keep buying your oil. But now they become economic dependencies upon China purchasing that oil. And so China has more leverage. Now you've got the whole Gulf, every country across Asia, virtually all of the world. And it turns out that when America hollowed out its base, its manufacturing base, it can no longer manufacture weapons without China. And so F-35 fighter jets, like drones, everything needs China's rare earth minerals, their commodities, and their manufacturing. So now the American military is dependent upon China. Europe is dependent upon China. The Gulf countries are dependent upon China. Iran's dependent upon China. Russia's dependent upon China. The whole world is dependent upon this manufacturing base that is effectively exporting all around the world. Now, it's only with that backdrop that you can really figure out what's going on here. Because if you think this is about, religion, if you think this is about a nuclear program for the last 40 years we've been told is 2 weeks away, this is about energy. And it's always been about energy. Because whoever controls the energy and the flow of that energy, i.e. the ports, controls power in their region, in their hemisphere. And so that's kind of like the entire backdrop to help you analyze and understand this. Now, what comes next? I mean, I'll take a quick pause there, and then we'll go deep into the real Iran war. Did you have any questions on any of that? Or
do I have any questions? Yes, I've got a sheet covered in them. Let me see if I can outline this a little bit. So to see if I'm kind of getting this clear view of the situation, which does make sense to me as well, is that largely the operation is driven by trying to cut off energy flows into China because that's putting them in too much of a powerful position. Is the goal to redirect the energy somewhere else, or is it more or less like, no, we're just looking to cut it off? And would that also explain, because if I'm not mistaken, Venezuela was also shipping energy to China as well. So does that also explain the reason for the Venezuelan operation beforehand, which meant they were probably already looking to do this in the coming months after the fact?
Yeah, here's the really interesting thing. I'm sure you've been consuming all the news, watching a bunch of podcasts, listening to the trad media, listening to alternative media. The one thing you'll notice is nobody's got an agreed upon reason for this war.
Right.
No one can actually come up with a reason. Like, everyone's got theories, but no, there's so much divergence in terms of what people think's happening here. Some people think it's about taking out an evil regime. Other people think it's about choking off China. Other people think it's about protecting Israel, and Israel rules the world, and they're forcing America to do it. Other people think that you've got to take out the threat of a nuclear program, and all of those narratives are used for whichever one like suits your ideology or your algorithm. Where the way that I see this is that firstly, is America a sovereign state? Well, I said that it's controlled by the financial industrial complex.
Right.
And the financial industrial complex is transnational capital.
Correct.
So when you understand that, you realize there's no such thing as America first.
Yeah.
Because Trump works for his lobby, and his lobby is big tech, big military, and big financial. And so he works for them. Now, he has to make you think that this is MAGA or America first, but he works for his lobbies. That's who pays the bill. And they all have terms and conditions when they funded him. So there is no such thing as America in that sense.
Let me jump in for 1 second, because this is where I'm getting stuck too. So thinking about the transnational, like the financial industrial complex, the part that I'm missing is I would view this as actually hurting the flows into US equities that they own, and that this would actually impact the market in a negative way. So I'm trying to figure out, I guess again, they want to have maybe control over the actual resources themselves. I'm trying to figure out why they're basically, how this benefits them in the end, if it's going to, in the short term, impact the assets that they hold.
Yeah. So if you're transnational capital, you need an event that redirects capital flows and energy flows all around the world. You're watching that event right now.
Yeah.
If you wanted the Strait of Hormuz to be closed, then you would do everything that has just happened.
Yep.
Transnational capital would create a narrative via Israel, a narrative via Iran, and then you would use the US military and the Israeli military and the Iranian military, and you would come up with something like what we're seeing right now. And so, what is actually happening right now? Well, let's take a zoom out. So we had basically a confusing narrative. Originally, it was about a nuclear program. We had the 12-day war prior, which led to essentially decapitation campaigns on hardline IRGC members in Iran. We had severe economic stress for Israel. When it got hit, Mossad targets were taken out. Various other targets were taken out. The ports were closed. Tourism's dead. Exports are down. They've stopped exporting their liquefied natural gas to Egypt and Jordan. So now they've got revenue is down. The stock market's doing very well because it's a militarized stock market, but the debt is being burdened. Same thing as America, right? You're increasing the debt. You're taking out strategic industries, and you're vassalizing a nationalized country into private corporate interest. That's what was happening. That was effectively happening at the Israel level. Now, at the Iran level, you had the decapitation campaign, and you had the quote unquote taking out of the nuclear program, and a narrative to off ramp because, IRGC has a very, very strong military ballistic missile program and various other things. It's made out like it's just nothing, but they've got very advanced technology, cybersecurity, ballistic missiles that there's no solution for. It's an efficient military. It's not America.
They've got hypersonic missiles, as far as I know.
Correct. Yeah, hypersonic missiles. I'm no military expert, so sorry if I get those wrong. I've been learning on the move, more financial. But I listen to experts that help me figure out that stuff. And so so effectively, if you're the Gulf countries, you're in the now. You've got these U.S. military bases. You've got Israel that's an agitator, and you've got Iran that is also an agitator through the IRGC. What do you want as the Gulf countries, as transnational capital? Well, you want all of this shit out of your region. You want Israel to stop agitating and Greater Israel project and making the justification for war. You want IRGC to dismantle hardliners that are not on board with a regional stability plan, that effectively have a narrative, but they profit from. The IRGC has its own economy that's separate to the Iranian economy. They control banking, they control military, they control various other resources, and a lot of the weapons trafficking routes that allow for the resistance economy. Now, they fund these resistance groups because it gives them leverage when they're trying to negotiate and get sanctions removed. And so you, as a Gulf country that wants regional stability and want investment and want, you want decolonization, you want the US bases out, you want Israel to stop agitating wars, you want IRGC to normalize with the Gulf countries, and you want the resistance, militia groups and the resistance economy out, all of them, and the American proxies as well. So you've got ISIS, Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, all that stuff. Hezbollah is on the Iran side. America has ISIS, Al Qaeda, and Israel. And then you have the different groups that come from representing Turkey interest or Saudi interest or other factions that want to be that had their different version of a relationship. So what's a great way of getting all of them out? Well, one thing you can do is get as much influence over American financial powers. So the CEO of Saudi Aramco allows for an IPO at 2% of its oil. Saudi allows for 2% of its oil company to go public, Saudi Aramco, then gets a board seat on BlackRock, and is now able to influence BlackRock, then all of the deals is co-investment. All of the AI infrastructure, all of these data centers, X, all of this technology, OpenAI, all this stuff, ChatGPT, all of it is co-invested with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. And so the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund is putting up the capital. BlackRock is pulling together everyone's pensions and American people. And so they're able to now, as transnational capital, exert influence over military and military strategy. So what I think is happening here right now is that they needed to co-opt Trump. So how did the Gulf countries co-opt? Everyone thinks they just think of Israel, APAC, all of these things. But what, APAC gets from American Jewish billionaires and Christian billionaires that are subscribed to the evangelical ideology, they fund APAC. And because it's funded by Americans, they're able to use it as a lobby without being classified as a foreign interest.
Yep.
Even though all of those people are aligned with Israel. And so you have that confusing thing. Well, Qatar can't do that. Yep. Saudi can't do that. So what do? Well, they set up funds and feeder funds. And one of them they set up was called Affinity Partners. And it's got $5 billion of Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund money. And it's managed by Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so Trump wants a Trump Tower in Gaza. He wants a Trump Tower in Saudi. He wants a Trump Tower. So all of a sudden, after this, you get BlackRock setting up their office in Saudi. You get these financial institutions. Saudi starts opening up its financial markets and its stock market. It suddenly starts doing bonds with China, Chinese investment banks. And suddenly you're getting capital that's flowing over here as a result of that. And then Trump comes into presidency, and Trump has a $5 billion fund that smashes any type of APAC funding, anything that the Israel lobby can produce, that relies upon regional stability. So effectively, the Gulf countries, I think, set up a plan in order to acquire Israel via UAE, normalize with Israel, make UAE look like someone that's subordinate to Zionists. They get the reputational damage. You start doing good cop, bad cop. You settle all the regions like Yemen and Somalia and Sudan and Libya. You decide who's going to control all the ports. They split it up between Qatar, UAE, all these different people. You get BlackRock to effectively get as many of the deals over to you. You acquire it. You do reverse IMF, reverse colonization. And then what do? Well, you say to the US military, while everyone's talking and thinking it's Israel that controls the world, can you go and get rid of all Iran's militias and take out IRGC hardliners? Okay.
Interesting.
And so what does America do? America has a narrative. Israel controls the world. Releases Epstein files.
Yep.
Has a narrative where Americans now all hate Israel. They're asking questions about. They're saying Israel rules the world. They're saying Trump works for Netanyahu. You allow that narrative to persist. You buy Trump, and then you get Trump to basically, on his last, where he's got nothing to lose, give him his family legacy, investments that are going to be profiting from regional stability in the Middle East, and you get them to take out the factions of your enemy, and then you normalize with the other factions. Here's what's really important. Here's the bit that they think of Iran as a monolith. Is America a monolith? Is Canada a monolith? No, you have a bunch of people that are very different, and Iran is, very, very different views on politics. And you have, very different types of people in Iran. Now, think of it in simplest terms as two factions of power. Let's call it the pragmatic reformers you had a helicopter go down, and suddenly we get a reformer prime minister in Iran. You have the 12-day war, and suddenly a bunch of hardliners are taken out in the IRGC. Then you have continual negotiations, but you keep saying negotiation off, negotiation on, negotiation off, negotiation on. Then you have the operation where Scott Bessent did a currency war to destroy the Iranian currency.
Yep.
And then you put Mossad in order to create the uprising.
Yep, the riots.
And then you create the media attention to take you destroy the savings of the Iranian people after years and years of sanction. You create an inflationary cycle. If you look at Lindsey Graham, they were all saying Mossad's there, and Scott Bessent said he did the currency operation. And you destroy everyone's savings. You create a narrative that there's about to be, a government, a revolutionary uprising. You create a cartoon character that the Shah's son, that they're saying he's going to take over. He's just a cartoon character. He's never going to take over. And then you effectively get people to come up against the IRGC. And then you start arresting a bunch of the IRGC members from within the IRGC. So that's the bit the media doesn't tell you.
Yep.
You take out the ones that are on board the plan. And then when that doesn't work, that doesn't eliminate. So you've had all these different attempts to try and get it to the version of the IRGC and government that is wanted by transnational capital. Then you do the final one. You do the big war. And in the big war, you get the US military to take out certain people. You get Israel to take out, at the same time, to take out Hezbollah, which is, some of the militias which we're witnessing right now. By the way, this is a story that everyone will hate because here's the thing. Everyone's going to hate it. It's when you explain, because everyone's got these emotions of thinking that something else is happening here and it means so much and so many people died. Like, this is how the system is. This is how evil the system is. And so you've got these two cartoon characters, right? In America, they're like, you've got this evil Islamist terrorist that's the center of terrorism. You've got to cut off the snake. They want to kill us. They want to bomb us. They want to nuke us. Death to America, death to Israel. That's one version. That's the faction of the IRGC in Iran-Contra affair that were aligned with Israel and American military-industrial complex. They want chaos. They want the region to be forever in war so that military companies can profit from war. And again, it's done through plausible deniability and higher levels and compartmentalization. It's never going to be as simple as I'm explaining. That's the part that is aligned with military. Forever war, create chaos, war forever. And you need both Israel and the higher levels of the IRGC and the death to America narrative in order to keep the wartime economy alive. And within here, there are people whose power and wealth in a mafia group, when there's sanctions, there's also a mafia. They want to preserve the status quo. They would never be on board a plan to move to regional stability because they would give up their power.
Yep.
With factions of power. And so when you say Iran wants, there's no such thing. That you've just got factions of power that have self-interest. And then you've got a lot of people that are genuinely on a religious mission, anti-imperialist. But they're painted into another cartoon. The other cartoon is, this is the last holy people, the last fighters and defenders that are taking on imperialism and the defenders of the Palestinian cause. Now, that narrative is useful to recruit the people that you need in your army. But at the top, there's war profiteering as well, and people don't know what they're working for or who they're working for. So you have these two extreme cartoons, and they have a completely different version. And then you have the people that hate Iran, that used to live there, that made loads of money under the Shah. And they moved to America once the Islamic Revolution happened. And obviously they hate the IRGC because they liked Iran how it was before this. And the sanctions came from that. And so when you create severe economic pressure to try and overthrow your government, and then they're brought up in America and Britain and Canada, they're just going to see the Western narrative of what the IRGC is. And whenever you have these covert operations, you just see a brutal, radicalized, and all that stuff. But then they benefit. So you have all of these different things put together. Now, what changed? And this is just the linchpin that I think plugs it all together. Economic sanctions destroyed the economy. You had, we'll have a nuclear deal. Then Trump ripped it up. Then they start negotiating again. All that stuff. Now there's proven that they all sit around the table and negotiate. That happens. There was diplomacy, and then every time they got to a deal, Israel would either do a preemptive strike, and this time America did a preemptive strike. Because on Friday, before this war started, Oman said Iran has agreed to all term, and Oman was the mediator.
Yeah, that was in Geneva.
Agreed to zero nuclear enrichment, a framework where the enriched uranium would go to Russia and China would provide security guarantees. Then we had the framework for what would happen with Gaza, which is the border peace thing. I won't go too deep into that, but effectively the next step is to have a coalition of Arab security take over Israel's illegal occupation. And at that stage, Israel did everything to stop that happening, because these are the military arm. They don't want peace, right? But China wants peace. China wants an Iran that wants to do business, a Saudi that wants to do business. It will tolerate Israel, but it definitely doesn't want an Israel that's an agent of U.S. military corruption and power. So it wants a tame Israel. It wants Gulf countries that want to do business, and it wants an Iran that wants to open up markets to regional stability. And so China put together a plan, and that plan was. It's been executed for the last 5 years, normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, back the Gulf Cooperation Council with BRICS, and make sure that Iran has everything it needs from both Russia and China so that it's able to effectively, strategically destroy Israel and take out all the US military bases. So now you've got the game set up. Okay. What are the two weapons that you can fire? A financial one and a military one. So now you've got a game between the factions of power. Let me set this up as well. So we are not in a war between Iran, Israel, and America. We are in a war between the military industrial complex and the factions aligned with the military industrial complex that profit from it, and the financial industrial complex that are aligned with Gulf countries and China and American financial powers that now want the build back better phase. They're done with the war. Now they want the build back better phase, and they want the military to go somewhere else. Okay. So they don't lose their military. They want the forever war somewhere else. But the military, because Saudi and the Gulf countries are now exerting their influence. So let me tell you who's actually in the war. You've got the US military industrial complex. You've got hardliner factions of the IRGC that are maintaining their power from war. You've got Israel and the Zionist ideology. You've got the neocons in America that are owned by the AIPAC and US lobby. And that's the military industrial complex, one side of the war. The other side of the war, you got the financial industrial complex that wants regional stability. You got the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. You got the reformist pragmatists within Iran, i.e. the Iranian government. And you got people within IRGC that recognize that this is an existential threat. And so they're on board with the more hardliner elements of the IRGC. So it requires change with these elements. And you still have the IRGC. You make the world think it's regime change, because if you have regime change, you'll have an uprising. You'll turn Iran into Syria with 90 million people. You'll create a vacuum. You'll create carnage. That's the military model. This is the financial industrial complex. And they're aligned with China and BRICS. So you've got the GCC, you've got BRICS, you've got factions within Iran, And they have to turn part of the regime change that will happen in Israel as well, which will be a GCC aligned rather than America aligned, less radicalized, puppet government, just like you have in Syria right now. He used to be head of ISIS, but now he works for Turkey in the GCC. He
Yep.
has a job, and his job is to get regional stability in line with the regional powers. And if he fails, you just take him out and call him a terrorist. If he succeeds, then you need a successor. So the real battle is Mick versus Fick. It's not Iran versus Israel versus America. When you follow the money, that's what it's saying. Now, okay, so you won, and I believe Fick will win.
Yep.
There's more power there, but you got to de-radicalize all these mix. You got the radical Zionists, the evangelical Christian neocons in America. You got to take out those IRGC hardliners, and you got to reform Israel. So you defund Israel eventually, so it's not being funded by a military. You get Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, and all these people to de-radicalize the evangelical Christians in America. These are connected to high levels of CIA operatives. And then you strategically weaken Israel, strategically weaken Iran, and now you just got to get the US military bases out. And so that faction, I believe, is coordinating the next stage of the theater. The negotiations haven't stopped. Part of the negotiations that led to this battle was that they said, start the war, and we'll know who the people that derail the plan are. Some of them might kill children in a school in Iran, and 165 6 to 12-year-old children were killed, and they're investigating it right now. My guess is that's an Israel operation. Yep. America's deciding whether they're going to cover up for it. But when you find out who's going off plan, those are the people that need to be regime changed and eliminated. Okay? So every time someone goes really too far, like blowing up water plants that would effectively, those are the people that are going to be eliminated. Until the last people standing are the ones that were sat around the negotiation table. You'll notice how everyone that was negotiating is still alive today. That's what you'll notice. And I reckon they stay alive till the end. And there are people from IRGC, people from the Iranian government, and they'll stay.
Well, I'm trying to see like how this plays out, and I'm trying to take it all in as fast as I can, and then try to make sense of it for myself, make sure I'm following everything along. Because what like appears to me is like, okay, so if we take out the hardliners in Iran, it would also, I think, weaken Iran at that point in time as well too. At the same time, is also weakening and then also kind of appeasing Israel, because you can't have Iran then as a threat for the reason why they're built up. It's like you've got a weaker and appeased Israel. You've got a weaker Iran. You're going to get more stability in that region. At the same time, I'm thinking about from the financial industrial complex in terms of like stock market flows as well. It's like, okay, we're going to weaponize, rent the U.S. military to go in and do this operation. We're going to have increased fiscal spending as a result of it. We've also got, Kevin Warsh coming in May, who was a bit of a hawk beforehand, which would give him the credibility to go ahead and print like crazy, essentially, to finance this operation. It also would explain why China and Russia are not getting directly involved. They have no interest in keeping, I think, the current Iranian regime propped up. There's no threat of World War III here. They're going in and basically trying to clean house so they can actually make, which is a very, inhumane way of saying it. But they're going in to clean house so they can get stability in the region and then actually profit from it, selling the resources to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so let's there's a bit more layer on top of there.
Oh, good.
It's so layered, it's so confusing. But I hope it's as clear as I can make it. Okay. And thanks for summarizing it as well. So the biggest trade at the end of this is two things. Regional stability in the Middle East changes the entire world forever. Yeah. If the financial industrial complex can engineer a scenario where they get a bit of control over the Strait of Hormuz, then that helps them in the multipolar world. Yeah. If you can also get a bit of India, that helps them in the multipolar world. If you can get a bit of UAE, that helps them in the multipolar world. So you've got these factions where the financial industrial complex is hedging for the new world order. And they have their leverage points. India is one of those leverage points into BRICS. UAE is one of the leverage points into the GCC. These are all co-opted financial, but and so you've got those different factions. Now, if at the end of this you get a bit of control of the Strait of Hormuz, then that's really, really important for the financial industrial complex to use the falling US empire to get as much power as it can. So now it is using America to get everything it possibly can. Venezuelan oil, Strait of Hormuz access routes, and partnership with its strategic points, take over, and get as much power out of the Israel vacuum, and also open up Iran. And so what do you have at the end of the big trade at the end of this is regional stability in the Middle East. That's nothing would produce higher returns than that. And again, you needed to apologize. I also need to apologize. I'm putting on my analytical hat here. If you want me to put my humanitarian hat on, I'd be speaking very differently.
Yep.
I believe it's absolute crimes against humanity. But I have to put one hat on because I can't be a normal human and analyze rationally, because they're completely the opposite. Geopolitics is the opposite of human emotion.
Yeah.
Like, you can be friends and enemies, and you can do the most inhumane things, and you can be forced to do things that no human would ever do on their own because of the reality of survival of your country.
Yeah.
Okay. So me speaking like this is not me being human. This is me taking my human hat off and analyzing in reality, because the human hat will get this completely wrong. I'll pick a side. I'll look for a sport. I'll look for my team, and I'll start cheering them on, and I'll start making enemies with my fellow humans because we think differently, and then divide and conquer, So I'm trying to get out of that. Right. So the analysis, you got that. What else is the biggest financial weapon of mass destruction that you could fire? Take the Strait of Hormuz, the 20% of LNG, fertilizers, massive resources, shut it. And who's going to benefit from that?
Wouldn't the US and Russia?
Beneficiaries, US and Russia.
At the detriment of Europe, correct?
Russia has just got, in order to get oil relief, you pump the price of oil right up. Now the American oil producers, they get to profiteer. The military get their swan song in the Middle East before they move into actual defense mode rather than attack forever war mode. They get to drain the munitions of Iran and Israel, potentially, depending on how that goes. And you get Iran to blow up the US military bases. And so now the Gulfs are free from their US military bases, and Iran is just blowing up US military bases. And it's going after, and it's destroying US's position in the Middle East. And that's what they're negotiating. They're saying anybody that wants access to the Strait of Hormuz, take out your US envoy or your US, whatever it's called. What's the word I'm looking for? When you have a country within a country, a building.
Oh, geez.
Embassy.
There we go.
Sorry, I'm losing my head. I've been up so long, like on this 24/7 commentary on this shit. Take out your US embassy, and then your Israeli embassy, and then you can get access to the Strait of Hormuz. China, you can have access. Everyone else, no, you ain't getting access. Come to the table, negotiate. Russia comes along and says, hey, anybody need any oil? Anyone need any gas? Guess what? We can get oil and gas pretty much anywhere. And so everyone is running over to Russia. America is saying, hey, that Nord Stream pipeline that we blew up that meant that Germany doesn't have access to your gas. Well, now we're going to shut Qatar down because you hedged from Russia to Qatar. And now you're back to America.
Yep.
We're gonna set terms. You get a price crisis. You get a recession. we're gonna tell you how much LNG you're gonna buy from us, and you can buy some from our friends at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So America is now a ginormous liquefied natural gas energy exporter, and the Western Hemisphere is under the control of America.
Yep.
Russia is saying, I ain't going to help the Europeans. They've sanctioned us. China, India, you need some stuff? Yeah, we'll get it over to you. And so Asia is now getting relief by renegotiating with Russia. So now you've turned, what happened to the Gulf countries? Tourism down, shut down all the airports, take out their US bases. People are starting to wonder, the real estate's crashing. You're taking a temporary hit, but now what used to be called the Middle East is returning to what it used to be. It used to be called West Asia. The only reason it was called the Middle East is because London colonized it, France colonized it, and you were looking east and they considered it the middle. Prior to that, it was called West Asia. So you have turned the GCC into BRICS, into China, and you have now got a full-blown multipolar world. You've rebuilt West Asia, and you've put Europe under the dependency of the Western Hemisphere via American private interest. So the financial industrial complex has now got the sovereign wealth funds. It owns the West. It's vassalized Europe. It partners with China, and it's got its infiltration operations in both BRICS and the GCC to try and remain relevant in a multipolar world. Its assets under administration is going up and up and up. The people are going further and further and further into debt. The currency is being weakened, but what happened as soon as the war kicked off, Bitcoin turned around, the dollar started strengthening again.
I was going to say, wouldn't this also prop up Treasury demand for a while as well, too, by having just increased global chaos? So it's another way to just buy yourself more time to get more assets using those dollars.
Yeah, and you have oil going through the roof, which creates an inflationary cycle, which creates the narrative for how to get this over quickly and to apply exertion, how to apply negotiation pressure. So China effectively controls the price of oil. They knew this was going to happen. They built 1.2 billion barrels ahead of this. Wow. They partnered with Russia. They've got the rare earth minerals. America, once they lose all their munitions and military, they can't rebuild without China. Yep. They've got the rare earth minerals. They've got the components, So effectively, what's coming up in April? A meeting called the China Summit where Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping. I expect that that's going to change the world in April. Wow. So we've had this long operation. You had, Trump was involved in it all in term 1 and term 2. You had Abraham Accords. You had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. You had Biden in the middle. Then you had October the 7th. Then you had Israel had to ethnically cleanse and genocide the Palestinians. Egypt wouldn't let it happen. They held their border despite being bribed by America. IMF said, if you take them in, we'll give you your $18 billion debt pardoning. China said, don't worry, don't take it, hold strong. They then normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Gulf Cooperation Council started resolving their issues. They said, you take charge of Libya, we'll take charge of Yemen, we'll get this port. You, UAE, you go normalize with Israel. You're going to look like you're subordinate Zionist. You're going to get the reputational damage. Saudi's going to look like the good person. Qatar, you get Europe. You go invest in Europe. Make an LNG dependency. Make sure that they can normalize with Palestine. You had all of these different events that, when you understand it from this remit, this was the global reset into a multipolar world order. And eventually, you will have an Iran that is on board with China's vision, that's normalized with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and an Israel that, in theory, if this mission works, and I'm not saying it's simple, this is probably the hardest mission, you've got rid of all the proxies and all the states have stopped funding militias. Iran has not been funding any of their militias. And then you've got these operations where, unless you have a state sponsor, your militias are no longer going to, they need to either integrate or be eliminated. So this is a very complex operation. A lot can go wrong. But I believe that at the end of this, you get peace in the Middle East for real.
Yep.
And of course, there are people that are trying to sabotage this plan.
Yep.
And that's when, that's when you've got, and the hardest part is Israel. Obviously the hardest part is Israel. They build their whole economy out of being an agitator and profiteering from war. But in the end, you had the border peace set up, which has got nothing to do, it has got to do with peace, but Trump gets to take credit for what China's negotiated. That's what's happening. China's done it. Trump gets to take credit, and he gets to get rich by facilitating this happening. Who's funding the border peace? The Gulf countries. So the Gulf countries are going to own Palestine.
Yep.
The Gulf countries are going to buy as much of Israel as they can. All of those is illegal settlements that Trump's profiteering from via affinity capital. You've got Trump that can try and deliver it for the Gulf countries. You've got the Gulf countries that are doing this aligned with China, and that faction of power is kicking ass. But they had to negotiate with the military, say, give us our swan song war, allow us to show our brochures and power, let us get the Pentagon budget up from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, and make sure you give us Europe. We want war in Europe. We want war in Central and South America. And we also want some strategic tension over the Asia Pacific region. But China would have said, nah, Taiwan's ours.
Yeah.
Russia would have said, Ukraine's ours. And America would have said, the Western Hemisphere is ours. We got Europe and we got Central and South America. You split it all up. And now what do you need to make that transition without causing, you need a three-way off-ramp. You need IRGC to look incredibly strong. We took out the US military bases. We took out Israel. Israel will never be the same again. All right. But we lost Khamenei. He's a martyr. We had all of these martyrs. Now it's time, because China's telling us we need to get our act in gear, and they're buying all of our oil. And so China will be the diplomat, is my forecast and prediction. And then Israel needs its off-ramp. They say, we took out the eye of the snake, all the militias, we've tamed Hezbollah, we tamed Hamas, we've done this. Netanyahu gets regime change. We're starting to see assassinations from Smotrich, Gavir's family, Netanyahu's brother, allegedly. I'm not sure if these things are true. This is all the fog of war information right now, but we're starting to see things like that. He's probably negotiated his exit, so he doesn't go to prison for his crimes. He probably ends up in Argentina with Milei, or Hungary with Olsen, or whoever. He's negotiated his exit. He's trying to be as useful to power. Say, get as much land as you can, and that will give us more leverage when we're doing the negotiation. So he's doing that. Meanwhile, the algorithms will destroy Israel's reputation, expose they've been in control, and all the lobby and all the AIPAC and all the crimes and all the shit. Where meanwhile it was a jurisdiction for the mafia, for a mafia to get away with their crimes, for testing the most sickest technology, military technology.
Yep.
And then they get a reformist, leftist, exposed October the 7th. That was Netanyahu. It wasn't us. GCC aligned, China aligned. And effectively, the Middle East belongs to Asia now. It's no longer America's territory. But the financial industrial complex wants as many choke points in there. Maybe it gets Summer Strait of Hormuz. Maybe BlackRock gets a bunch of assets there. BlackRock will get their, BlackRock portfolio companies will get all their defense contracts. And then we focus on what everyone really wants right now. AI data centers powered by nuclear energy to create a police and surveillance state and a global central bank digital currency while there's a multipolar world. So I think this is the global reset. I think it's a managed transition.
Yep.
And Israel gets its narrative. Oh, of course, America needs to say, we're strong. We're the strongest military in the world. We took out the nuclear program. And guess what? You all thought that this was going to be a forever war. I told you I'm the president. I'm the president of peace. I go there, strength. I get shit done, and then I leave, and you're not in a war. All of those neocon warmongers, look at them. They're the ones that did it. You lost faith in me. But, I'm the guy that gets shit done. And you thought we were going into a long, extended war. And then I think this is my prediction. And again, things can go wrong.
Yep.
That this is my best thinking that I can come up with. I think in the April China summit, whatever has been negotiated will be what's announced. And that will be the world order and everyone looking strong. But America has to look strong while it shrinks.
Yep.
Because the financial industrial complex still wants to host the most liquid capital markets. They want to dump as much debt as possible. And they want to, use the US stock market so that they can manage ETF flows into foreign countries. And so this war strengthened the dollar. What will happen as soon as this ends? Oil will crash and we'll get back to where we were. Weakening of the dollar,
yep.
Weakening of the petrodollar, weakening of the euro dollar, weakening of the Japan carry trade, pushing east. A slow managed decline of the dollar, which means foreign stock markets after this. So at the moment, the American stock market is least affected relative to foreign stock markets, and the dollar is strengthening relative to other currencies.
Yep.
Once the war ends and oil spiked, oil will strengthen the dollar. Oil crashes at the end. And then the foreign stock markets start outperforming the US stock markets. And the foreign currencies outperform the US currencies. Commodities continue to perform, is my estimation. But they don't want to kill the dollar. They just want to continue for as long as they can until the last bond is sold and they've dumped the low interest rate bonds on the American pensioners. And so the Cayman Island hedgies, they're all rolling over the debt right now, profiteering from the debt. All the other countries are selling their debt. Effectively, what's Trump going to do? We're going to take on the Fed. We're gonna take on the Fed. We're gonna do fiscal dominance. We're gonna unify Treasury fiscal and monetary policy, which means print a shit ton of money.
End of the credit cycle.
And then we're gonna reform pensions and regime change the Fed. You get interest rates down, and then the pensioners will take on the debt at the subsidized low interest rate. And so they'll just roll it over with short-term treasuries, dump it on the pensioners, while the financial industrial complex profits from transitioning the world to a multipolar world order. Unemployment continues to go down. Birth rates continue to be absolutely atrocious, except in Africa. And you need AI and robotics in order to create a police and surveillance state.
Holy crap. All right. Simon, I think that is a wonderful place to put a pin in it with that prediction coming for April. You and I actually have a few things coming up here. We got more stuff planned in the coming weeks, but I think we're going to have to get back together after this April Chinese summit to see how it aligns with what you're currently thinking. And I got to say, like, ultimately, it makes a lot of sense to me from what we've seen previously and the path that you've laid out here. I'm blown away, sir. I'm blown away. Tell everybody where they can go to check out your stuff. Is there anything else that you want to leave them with that you think is something to make sure the takeaway to watch for? What should Bitcoiners be thinking about in the coming days and weeks?
You can't buy Bitcoin into weakness. I don't know whether this is, look, it's kind of like an AI NASDAQ, it's an AI tech play at the moment. That's what it's doing. But eventually, with all this manipulation, with all what we're seeing with Jane Street, with all what we're seeing with this derivatives complex, this ends in a self-custody play. There's not enough gold for those paper gold contracts. There's not enough silver for those paper silver contracts. There's not enough Bitcoin for those paper Bitcoin contracts. Strategy will suck it up, or you suck it up and make sure you put it in self-custody. Enjoy the weakness. If we get lower and lower Bitcoin, just own more Bitcoin every day, every week, or every month, whatever's right for you. Enjoy it. You've got to have a long-term play here. If you're trying to trade this, you will get wrecked. You're not an insider. You don't know where this is going to go. You can't have enough real commodities. This is a self-custody play. we'll cover it another time, but BlackRock, their funds are starting to blow up.
Yeah, the private credit.
Some of those private credit is an AI trade. We'll probably get more weakness here. But so far, forget about the price. Your job is to get as much Bitcoin as possible over the next 10 years. I'm pretty sure you're going to be fine because this 100% ends in a self-custody play. That's the real play at the end of this. And the only way you fight against the technocratic Orwellian surveillance state nightmare is that proof of weapons network. The resistance is proof of work. So yeah, I'm on X and I give real-time updates. I'm on Spaces if you want to ask questions. I still going live every week on YouTube. And then simondixon.com. I take these crazy long monoliths that I can't help but do. And I put them into like 10-minute AI summaries. And they take my 1 hour and summarize it pretty well. So I put all of that on my blog on Simon.